The Italian Bronze Age, spanning roughly from 1800 to 900 BC, lays the foundation for many key developments that would later shape the historical period. Named for the widespread use of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, this era saw bronze as the dominant material for tools, weapons, and ornaments. It remained the main metal throughout this time and well into the Iron Age. This period is typically divided into 4 stages: early, middle, recent, and final. Many defining aspects of later Italian history begin during this time, including the earliest signs of stable settlements on sites that would become major cities such as Rome and Bologna burials, with grave goods also emerged, reaching their peak in the 7th century BC. Moreover, the beginnings of commercial activity appeared, with new traditions in ceramics and metalwork, as well as trade links across Europe and the Mediterranean. This era also reveals the first indications of distinct ethnic regions within Italy. Together, this evidence helps trace important long-term developments such as state formation, social hierarchy, Mediterranean economic influence, and the emergence of ethnic identities back to the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC. The Bronze Age was characterized by the establishment of permanent settlements, which appeared in northern Italy during the early phase and spread to central and southern regions in the middle period. Major centers such as Rome, Bologna, Bari, and Taranto saw continuous habitation from this era onward. In northern Italy, the terra mare settlements of the Middle Bronze Age typically covered between 1 and 10 hectares and likely housed several hundred inhabitants. Central Italian settlements were smaller, averaging about 1 hectare, until larger sites began to emerge during the recent Bronze Age. The middle and recent phases witnessed significant population growth, but the transition to the final Bronze Age brought challenges, particularly in the Po Valley, where the terra mare culture collapsed. This was likely linked to the broader disruption around 1200 BC that affected Mycenaean Greece, which had strong connections with the Po settlements. However, new centers such as Fratesina emerged on the fringes of these areas, prospering through long-distance trade and the production of goods such as metals, pottery, and glass. In central Italy, the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age shows more continuity. Although some site consolidation took place, settlements on lower, less defensible ground were abandoned, while those in elevated positions thrived, including Luni sul Mignone, San Giovinale, and Narse in Etruria, as well as Rome, Ardea, and Lavinium in Latium. The culture of central Italy during the Middle and recent Bronze Age is commonly referred to as the Apennine culture, recognized by its burnished pottery with incised designs. This pottery is found across much of Italy, mostly from settlement contexts, and shows a remarkable level of cultural uniformity alongside local metalwork. Graves from this period are mostly egalitarian, reflecting a society with little social differentiation, though still connected through trade with other Mediterranean cultures. Mycenaean pottery, especially from the late 15th to the 13th centuries BC, has been discovered in southern Italy in significant quantities, though it appears less frequently in central and northern regions. Local imitations, known as Italo-Mycenaean ware, became common in the 13th century, suggesting workshops operated by Mycenaean artisans. By the 12th century BC, local copies outnumbered imports, and Mycenaean pottery imports dwindled until resuming in the 8th century. However, evidence from metalworking suggests that contact may have continued through other means. The Bronze Age also saw the import of other exotic items, including amber, ivory, faience, and bronze objects such as swords and fibulae. Metalworking itself was highly developed, and large hoards of bronze objects dating to the final Bronze Age have been found. These collections, often weighing several kilograms, indicate the work of skilled artisans using metal from sources such as Etruria and Sardinia, where foreign involvement, possibly Phoenician, may have influenced mining and smelting activities. This era is also crucial for the earliest traces of ethnic identity. Although difficult to determine without written evidence, recent studies suggest that distribution patterns of certain artifacts correspond to regional groups, known from later periods networks, in areas that would later become Etruria and Venetia can be seen during the final Bronze Age, along with less distinct networks in regions such as March, Umbria, Apulia, and Basilicata. Other areas do not show such clear patterns. This approach, based on material culture and trade patterns, offers a more reliable insight into early identity formation than simply applying later ethnic labels backward. It also supports the idea that some cultural identities in Italy have prehistoric origins. Some cultural features, such as ancient festivals and priesthoods, may indeed have roots extending into this era. Research into these early identities is still in its early stages, and ongoing discoveries, possibly supported by genetic studies, may provide a clearer picture in the future. The transition from the final Bronze Age to the early Iron Age marks a significant turning point in the development of ancient Italy. During this period, notable transformations can be seen particularly in Etruria, which emerges as the leading cultural and political region in central Italy. Etruria, along with neighboring Campania and the area around Bologna, shows a distinct shift in settlement and cultural practices. This shift reflects the move from Proto-Villanovan to Villanovan traditions. By contrast, in Latium, especially in Rome, continuity is more evident, with long-standing settlements that trace back to earlier periods around 1000 BC. Burial practices began to spread widely across central Italy, offering new insights into the social hierarchy and the rise of a wealthy elite engaged in increasingly luxurious lifestyles. In Etruria, the most profound changes occurred during the transition from the Proto-Villanovan to the Villanovan phase. These shifts are visible in settlement patterns, burial customs, economic activity, and social organization. Proto-Villanovan culture, which emerged in the 12th century BC, is associated with the rise of cremation as the dominant burial practice, replacing inhumation. This change was likely influenced by cultural movements from across the Alps. Other distinctive features include biconical urns, decorated pottery, and particular forms of weaponry and personal ornaments. Villanovan culture, fully developed by the 9th century, spread across Etruria, northern Italy, the Adriatic coast, and into Campania. The cemeteries from this period grew in size and permanence, reflecting the establishment of stable settlements. Ashes were often placed in urns shaped like huts or formed from impasto pottery buried in small shafts. Over time, burials became more elaborate, signaling the rise of a powerful elite. For example, Tomb AA1 from Veii contains a wealth of grave goods, including a chariot, weapons, and banqueting equipment, all of which emphasize the tomb owner's high status. In Latium, cultural practices during the early Iron Age parallel those of southern Etruria. Burial sites from this phase, such as those at Gabii, Rome, and the Alban Hills, often contain hut-shaped urns and miniature vessels, suggesting a shared cultural framework. These cemeteries reflect both local traditions and the influence of neighboring regions. Settlement patterns in Etruria changed dramatically in the 10th century. BC scattered villages were replaced by larger, more strategically located plateaus that would eventually develop into major urban centers like Veii, Caere, Tarquini, and Populonia. Similar developments occurred in Campania, where sites like Capua and Ponte Cagnano grew in size and population. These new centers often occupied areas over 100 hectares compared to the much smaller Bronze Age settlements, and benefited from access to fertile land, rivers, and the sea. Their emergence is linked to a wider process of village abandonment and population movement. This trend has been described as Protourbanization, reflecting an early stage in the formation of urban culture. However, these developments did not create unified cities immediately. Instead, settlements took on a patchwork appearance, with pockets of habitation surrounded by fields and burial sites. Whether these areas were politically unified remains a topic of debate. Some scholars suggest they were structured around large family groups similar to the Roman gentes, while others argue for an emerging centralized authority. The burial record provides some evidence for the existence of these larger social groups, such as family tumuli at Caere and clustered tombs at Osteria delosa. Nonetheless, the idea that clans dominated society before political states took shape may be more a modern projection than an ancient truth. While later historical sources speak of powerful leaders during this period, evidence for clan-based governance remains limited. In the early Iron Age, Latium followed a similar, though somewhat delayed pattern. Settlements like Rome, Ardea, and Gabii maintained continuity from the Bronze Age and began to grow during the 9th century BC. Smaller sites disappeared around this time, suggesting a process of population consolidation. However, Latin cities were generally smaller than their Villanovan counterparts, covering 20 to 50 hectares, with surrounding territories of up to 300 square kilometers. Like Etruscan centers, these sites developed around elevated plateaus, gradually forming proto-urban communities that foreshadow the rise of fully developed city-states in the centuries to come. During the early Iron Age, we see the emergence of the first foreign settlements along the shores of Italy. This development was likely driven by the presence of rich mineral resources, especially metal ores such as copper, tin, and iron, which were highly sought after by traders. In exchange, Italy received goods and pottery from the Greek world and the Near East. Between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, both Greek and Phoenician influences became increasingly significant in western Italy. Etruria, with its abundant mineral deposits, was particularly attractive to foreign traders, especially since Greece and Phoenicia lacked comparable resources. The northern coastal region of Etruria is still known today as the Collines Metallifères, or metal-bearing hills, reflecting its long-standing association with metallurgy. While the metal resources were a major factor in attracting foreign interest, the rise of thriving settlements in Tyrrhenian Italy also played a key role. It is likely that local communities were already exploiting these metals and that they managed and controlled access to them. The growing prosperity of these settlements may have been as important as the resources themselves in drawing traders from abroad. Two main factors contributed to the intensified foreign presence during this period. The first was the expansion of Phoenician settlements across the western Mediterranean during the 9th and 8th centuries BC. This movement is often explained as a response to geopolitical pressures in the Near East, particularly the rise of the Assyrian Empire. However, economic opportunities in the West, such as fertile lands and valuable metal deposits, likely played an equal or greater role. During this time, Carthage was founded, and Phoenician communities spread across regions like North Africa, Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. Although fewer Phoenician settlements are detected in Italy compared to these areas, their influence on local culture and trade was significant. The second major factor was the founding of Pithecusae on the island of Ischia by Greek settlers, particularly from Euboea, located on a peninsula with natural harbors on both sides. Pithecusae served both as a residential area and as a commercial hub. Excavations have revealed workshops for metalworking, evidence of pottery production, and an extensive cemetery with over 1,000 graves, pointing to a population that may have reached between 5,000 and 10,000 people by the mid-8th century BC. The archaeological finds include pottery from Euboea and Corinth, as well as imported items from the Near East, such as Egyptian scarabs and Phoenician amphorae. These objects suggest a diverse community with Greek, Phoenician, and possibly Etruscan inhabitants. Pithecusae quickly became a center for regional and long-distance trade, engaging in the distribution of metals, pottery, and other goods across the Mediterranean. A wine jug made there, for example, was discovered in Carthage, showing the settlement's role in maritime commerce by around 740 BC. However, by the early 7th century BC, attention shifted to new Greek settlements on the Italian mainland and in Sicily, founded on more fertile and strategically valuable locations. The first Greek settlement on the mainland was established at Cumae around 750 BC, followed shortly by Zancle and Naxos in Sicily. The influence of these Greek and Phoenician settlements on Italy is an ongoing subject of debate. While their presence certainly had an impact, it is no longer accurate to view this interaction as a case of a more advanced culture influencing a less developed one. Recent archaeological discoveries reveal that central Italy was home to complex proto-urban societies with organized economies and control over local resources. The relationship between the Greeks and the Italic peoples was one of mutual exchange, not dominance, and the connections formed during this period were part of a web of multi-directional networks rather than a simple center-periphery model. The close relationships that developed between Italian communities and their Mediterranean neighbors led to the rise of a richly interconnected culture along the western coast of Italy from the late 8th century BC onward. This cultural transformation is especially visible in the lavish materials found in the cemeteries of regions like Etruria, Latium, and Campania. While trade brought wealth, agricultural production also played a crucial role in sustaining these prosperous societies. Beginning around 730 BC, during the end of the early Iron Age, burial goods became richer and more elaborate, marking the start of what is known as the orientalizing period. This name reflects the strong influences from the Eastern Mediterranean, as seen in art and luxury items that inspired local Italian craftsmanship during this era. The Orientalizing period brought profound changes to central Italy. It was during this time that complex social structures began to emerge, including a clearly defined elite class and ruling figures in certain communities. These elites adopted new modes of display and consumption, especially in the form of lavish banquets and wine feasts. Technological and artistic skills were also advancing rapidly. Metalworkers and artisans produced intricate gold jewelry and carved ivory, much of it inspired by techniques from the Near East. Local pottery production evolved with fine wares, like the thin-walled bucchero. Sculptural and architectural innovations also appeared, signaling a new phase in urban development and artistic expression. cities became denser and more structured, and monumental buildings were constructed for the first time. The wealth generated from metal resources was further amplified by the expanding production of olive oil, wine, and grain. Imported goods from Greece and the eastern Mediterranean flowed in, greatly increasing in volume and transforming local customs and identities. By the late 8th century BC, exceptionally rich tombs began to appear, peaking in the 7th century. These burials often contained treasures made of precious metals, imported ceramics, banqueting vessels, weapons, chariots, and armor. The items included bronze tripods, cauldrons, luxurious drinking vessels, and ceremonial objects. Many were associated with feasting and wine drinking, including spits, cups, and graters used for preparing Greek-style beverages. Some of the most symbolic artifacts were ribbed bronze bowls used to filter aromatic ingredients in wine. The earliest examples were imported from regions like Assyria and Urartu and were found in the graves of high-ranking individuals. These objects reflect not just material exchange, but also the adoption of elite ideologies and symbols of power from the Near East. The craftsmanship found in these items reveals both imported and local influences. Skilled artisans, including Phoenicians and Syrians, settled in Italy and introduced advanced techniques in metalwork and goldsmithing, such as granulation and filigree. Ivory carving, glassmaking, and faience production also flourished. The early presence of Greek pottery styles in Italy, such as the chevron skyphoi made in Veii and other centers, further illustrates this rich cultural blending. Sculptures in stone have been found in 7th century Etruria, showing the work of Near Eastern trained artists adapting their craft to Italic contexts. Burial customs evolved as well. In the 7th century, large chamber tombs began to be built, closely resembling contemporary structures in Asia Minor. These impressive tombs were often used for several generations, serving as markers of family prestige and continuity. Some, like the monumental tombs in Caire, featured platforms and staircases suited to ancestor worship and ritual ceremonies. Although these tombs suggest the rise of powerful family groups, the elites of this period were not closed off. Wealth and influence remained fluid, and new families could still enter the upper ranks. The earliest examples of tomb paintings and decorative architectural imagery date to this era. In Veii and Caire, chamber tombs were built as early as the late 8th century. By the early 7th century, painted tombs began to appear. The Tomb of the Roaring Lions, dating to around 700 to 690 BC, and the Tomb of the Ducks, from about 680 to 670 BC, are among the first known cases of painted funerary art in Italy. This period marks a key moment in the development of complex cultural expression, blending local traditions with influences from across the eastern Mediterranean. Among the elite burials of early central Italy, the Regolini Galassi tomb at Caire stands out as one of the most celebrated examples. Now housed in the Vatican, its contents reflect extraordinary wealth and craftsmanship. The tomb was cut into rock under a tumulus and contained 2 burials, one of which may have belonged to a high-ranking woman. It showcased rich gold jewelry and impressive banqueting objects, along with silver plates featuring motifs reminiscent of Egyptian and Near Eastern art, including hunting scenes and procession imagery. Comparable material has been discovered in the Bernardini tomb at Praeneste in Latium, demonstrating a shared cultural atmosphere across the region. Another striking case is Tomb 70 from Laurentina. an elaborate burial belonging to a woman and dating to the mid-7th century BC. The tomb's contents include a chariot, a wooden throne, bronze furniture, and items associated with wine consumption, 2 serving tables, mixing basins, and cups. These objects closely resemble the iconography of rulers in the Near Eastern world, where powerful women also played prominent roles. Such parallels indicate a strong cultural influence from regions like Phoenicia and Neo-Hittite or Aramaean kingdoms, rather than through Greek mediation alone. Similar themes appear in Tomb 15 at Castel di Decima, dating to the late 8th century BC. This large burial chamber, containing a single male individual, held objects such as a scepter, silver vessels, a fan, bronze containers, weapons, horse equipment, and pottery. The presence of goods from places like Phoenicia and Thapsos highlights Italy's extensive connections with the wider Mediterranean. During this time, one of the most transformative cultural shifts was the adoption of writing. The Greek alphabet, itself adapted from Phoenician script, appeared in this region during the 9th or early 8th century BC. Interestingly, the oldest known Greek inscription comes not from Greece, but from Gabiae, south of Rome, inscribed on a local pottery vessel. The script is of Euboean Greek origin, suggesting early literacy and cultural exchange. Some scholars argue this inscription may be even older than previously thought. The alphabet spread rapidly across central Italy. Early Etruscan inscriptions include traces of Phoenician phonetics. Tools for teaching the alphabet, like the ivory tablet from Marsiliana, show that writing was quickly integrated into local education. By around 670 BC, Latin inscriptions appear as well, though they are initially fewer in number compared to Etruscan examples. Despite seeming disparities, this likely reflects differences in archaeological preservation rather than literacy levels. The dynamic exchange networks of this era profoundly influenced the societies of Etruria, Latium, and Campania. Elite lifestyles embraced imported luxury goods and symbols of power. Influences from the Near East appear in everything from funerary customs to the arts and architecture, enriched further by Greek contact following the establishment of settlements like Pithecusae and Cumae foreign artisans, especially Phoenician metalworkers and Greek potters, played a critical role in shaping local production. Workshops established during this period fostered a lasting tradition of Italic craftsmanship, laying the foundation for centuries of artistic and cultural development. Even as research continues to uncover earlier roots to these connections, the intensity and acceleration of cultural exchange from the late 8th century BC remains unmistakably pivotal. One of the most significant changes during the orientalizing period was the rise of urbanization, the growth of true cities. While the archaeological record often favors cemeteries over settlement sites, recent research is increasingly shedding light on the emergence of early cities in central Italy. Urbanization developed from the proto-urban settlements of the early Iron Age, and by the late 7th and 6th centuries BC, it had transformed the entire Etrusco-Latial Campanian region. The shift included the creation of communal spaces, denser and more organized residential areas, and the appearance of monumental buildings. Scholars have long debated when a settlement can be considered a city. Early definitions, such as the one proposed by Gordon Childe in 1950, listed characteristics like population density, specialization of labor, centralized control of surplus, monumental architecture, use of writing, and foreign trade. However, as more examples of ancient cities have come to light, especially from the Americas and Near East, These criteria are now seen as too restrictive. Cities can exist without writing or naturalistic art, and monumental architecture itself can precede the formation of urban societies. What matters most is the transformative effect of urbanization on politics, society, economics, and religion. A key development in this period was the construction of monumental buildings, which symbolized political authority and collective effort. Monumentalisation is marked by the intentional use of large-scale architecture for symbolic purposes rather than mere practicality. This became possible with the introduction of stone foundations and terracotta tiled roofs around the mid-7th century. BC tiled roofing had existed in Greece for centuries, but the technology needed for standardized mass production spread only later. First in the Corinthian region around 675 BC, and then to central Italy. Early examples of this building style appear at Acquarossa, San Giovanale, Murlo, and Rome. Italian builders adapted the technology to local conditions, crafting flat pan tiles with raised edges to withstand heavier rains. In Rome, workshops in the Velabrum began producing tiles by the late 7th century. Notable early constructions include a tiled building on the Sacra Via and the first phase of the Regia around 620 BC. Soon after, other major structures appeared. Buildings in the Comitium, near the future Temple of Castor, and on the northern Palatine slope. Though these early structures shared design elements with those in Etruria, they used local clay, highlighting the transfer and adaptation of ideas between regions. These stone and tile buildings evolved from earlier large wooden structures common during the early Iron Age, often mistakenly labeled huts due to modern bias. In reality, many of them were complex, long-lasting buildings with multiple rooms. Some sites, like the second phase of the Murlo complex and the Monte Tosto Sanctuary near Cairo, featured monumental courtyard buildings that served administrative or religious functions, sometimes dubbed palaces, though their exact roles remain debated. Temples began to appear in the early 6th century BC. The first known example is the Santo Mabono Temple in Rome, dating to around 580 BC. This structure set the pattern for what would become the typical Italic temple, with a raised podium, wooden superstructure, and decorative terracotta roofing. While inspired by Greek designs, the Italic version developed its own character. The trend of building temples reflects a shift in elite priorities. Resources were now invested in visible, communal religious architecture rather than private tombs. This change marks the rise of a public, civic mindset. The development of cemeteries also mirrored changes in society. In Latium, grave goods largely disappear by 550 BC, an indication of new ideals promoting social equality or equal standing before the law, possibly influenced by Greek notions of citizenship. In Etruria, however, tombs continued to house luxury items well into the 5th century BC, yet even here, subtle shifts can be seen. After 550 BC, circular tumuli gave way to more organized rectilinear rows of tombs, suggesting greater civic oversight over burial practices. The frescoed tombs of Tarquini, painted from the 6th century onward, some by Greek artists, depict scenes of feasting, athletic contests, and the prominence of married couples. These paintings reveal not only the shared values of the elite, but also distinctive local interpretations of Mediterranean cultural themes, particularly in how women are depicted in funerary art. Pithecusae marks one of the earliest signs of a growing Mediterranean trade network that became especially active during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, While much of our understanding comes from the rich evidence found in Etruscan cemeteries, it is now clear that this exchange extended across the Tyrrhenian and into wider regions. Etruscan cities, for example, played a major role as traders, sailors, and even occasional pirates. Rome and Latium were also likely active in this exchange, though their contributions have been obscured by gaps in the archaeological record and Roman writers' reluctance to acknowledge their commercial past. Early contacts included exchanges with Sardinian and southern Italian communities, reflected in finds such as bronze figurines and distinctive Sardinian bronze boats in Etruria, Campania, and Pithecusi. Trade with mainland Europe was also considerable, especially with Celtic elites in France, evidenced by the spread of Etruscan goods like Bucaro pottery. Shipwrecks provide vivid glimpses into this interconnected world. A notable example off the island of Giglio, dating to around 580 BC, contained a diverse cargo: metal ingots, wine, foodstuffs, Greek and Etruscan pottery, personal items, and even musical instruments. Such wrecks suggest that Etruscan traders were not passive recipients, but active players in Mediterranean commercial networks, along with direct maritime trade. Designated trading ports, known as emporia, were established as meeting points between locals and foreign merchants. Sanctuaries often stood at the heart of these trading hubs, serving both religious and economic functions. The coastal emporia of Gravisca and Pergi, active by around 600 BC, were cosmopolitan centers especially linked to the Greek world. Gravisca, for instance, contained sanctuaries dedicated to Greek deities like Aphrodite, Hera, and Demeter, and featured pottery, dedications, and inscriptions from across the Mediterranean, from Ionia and Corinth to Egypt. One famous dedication found there was a stone ship anchor offered by Sostratos of Aegina, reputed in ancient sources as an exceptionally successful merchant. Such sites illustrate the degree to which Tyrrhenian Italy, including nearby Rome, was deeply embedded in the commercial and cultural currents of the wider ancient Mediterranean. From the late 6th century BC onward, Greek activity at Gravisca began to decline. By around 480 BC, inscriptions and dedications suggest that the sanctuary became predominantly Etruscan, though the cults established during the earlier Greek phase, associated with figures like Aphrodite, Hera, and Demeter, continued to flourish. The sanctuary itself was rebuilt at intervals during the 5th century and only disappeared in the early 3rd century, likely due to Roman colonization. Gravisca serves as a vivid example of the intense cultural interaction between Etruscans and traders from across the Mediterranean, only a short distance from Rome itself, during a critical phase of urban and social development in the region. This mixture of local rulers and foreign merchants is reflected in stories like that of Demaratus, the Corinthian trader who settled in Tarquini and whose descendants became kings in Rome. Nearby Pergi further illustrates these far-reaching connections, especially with Eastern Mediterranean and Carthaginian spheres. Located about 13 kilometers from Caire and linked to it by a monumental road, Pergi was largely structured around its impressive temples. The earliest of these, Temple B, was built around 500 BC and dedicated to Uni Astarte, an Etrusco-Phoenician goddess constructed in Greek peripteral style. It featured decorative panels and statues depicting myths centered on Hercules and Uni. Attached to the temple was a courtyard complex with small annexed rooms, possibly related to ritual practices. Close by was another sacred area with altars and a well, indicating cult activity devoted to underworld deities. In the early 5th century, a second major structure, Temple A, was built in the distinct Tuscan architectural style, dedicated to Thesan, goddess of dawn and patroness of seafarers. The temple included a remarkable pediment sculpture depicting the epic tale of the Seven against Thebes. Its artistic style reflects influences from Cyprus and broader Mediterranean traditions, while maintaining a distinctly Etruscan reinterpretation. The most dramatic discovery from Pyrgi came in 1963. 3 gold tablets, found in a sacred deposit, inscribed in both Phoenician and Etruscan. These bilingual inscriptions record the dedication of the temple by Thefari Velianus, ruler of Caere, at the request of Uniastarte. The use of 2 distinct languages, not as identical translations but as culturally adapted versions, suggests a community fluent in both, highlighting Pyrgi's role as a shared religious and linguistic space. The language used on the Phoenician tablet aligns more closely with the Eastern Mediterranean dialect known from Cyprus, suggesting that many of the Phoenicians present were from that region, not Carthage. Other trading sites, or emporia, dotted the Tyrrhenian coast, forming a network that included ports like Punicum and Regis Villa. These centers were typically associated with sacred spaces, acting as hubs where traders could meet and exchange goods and ideas. They were closely linked to major inland cities and reflect the political and economic authority developing in Etruria. During this period, these maritime networks have significant implications for understanding Rome's early development. The Tiber River, navigable for warships like the Pentaconter, positioned Rome along a vital communication and trade route between the southern Tyrrhenian and the Etruscan coast. It is likely that Rome developed its own emporion-like zone at the Forum Boarium, the city's riverside marketplace. Artifacts found there, such as Greek pottery, amber, ivory, and imports from Laconia and Corinth, point to strong foreign contacts. Among the most famous finds is a carved ivory lion inscribed with an Etruscan name, Spurina. Though the site has been difficult to excavate fully due to later construction, the available evidence confirms that Rome was participating in the same vibrant Mediterranean networks that shaped its Etruscan neighbors. This period was crucial for the development of both Greek and Italian city-states. The interaction between them was mutually influential and played a significant role in their growth. Some scholars even propose that the Greek alphabet may have been invented at Pithecusae, a settlement where Greeks, Etruscans, and Phoenicians lived closely together. The peoples of Tyrrhenian Italy were far from passive in these cultural exchanges. The Etruscans, for instance, controlled major ports like Pyrgi and were known by Greek writers as skilled sailors and often as pirates. Evidence from inscriptions at Greek sanctuaries suggests that Etruscans regularly traveled to the eastern Mediterranean. Recent studies of shipwrecks, like those found off Giglio, Antibes, and Grand Ribot, show that Etruscan goods, especially amphorae, dominated the cargo, strongly pointing to their active role in maritime trade alongside other Central Italian peoples. The Villanovan, orientalizing, and archaic periods were marked by major shifts in central Italy that laid the foundations for later political structures. These changes were deeply connected to the energetic trade of the era. Eastern goods and cultural practices, such as writing, were introduced. A distinct elite class emerged, visible through their elaborate tombs and grave goods. Urban centers developed rapidly, leading to growing populations and increasing social complexity. All of these were indicators of early state formation and a more organized political landscape. Turning to the origins of Rome, this was the same transformative age in which the myths of Romulus, Remus, and other foundational figures began to circulate. These stories appear first in early Greek writings and later in Roman accounts. While these myths are not literal histories, scholars have tried to determine when and why they emerged. This can be difficult, as surviving authors are often later than the events they describe, and earlier works survive only in fragments. Attempts to tie myth creation to specific political or religious agendas are tempting but risky, as myths tend to evolve gradually through oral tradition rather than being invented by a single individual. These stories reflect the broader context of Greek colonization and cultural exchange in the Western Mediterranean during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. They show how local Italian communities didn't just absorb Greek ideas, but actively participated in reshaping these myths. Figures like Hercules, for example, appear in many local traditions. Adapted to reflect regional concerns and identities, archaeological evidence, such as temple decorations and terracotta roof tiles showing mythical scenes, offers a glimpse into how these myths were visually displayed in the landscape. Even if key structures like the early temples on the Capitoline Hill remain only partially understood, the most widely known version of Rome's foundation story comes from Livy, though he was far from the only ancient author to tackle the subject. Like many of his predecessors, Livy begins his account not with Romulus, but with the Trojan War and the journey of Aeneas to Italy. Yet he spends relatively little time on the period before Romulus, and dismisses much of this early mythology as poetic invention rather than historical fact. He prefers to focus on the reigns of the kings, starting with Romulus, and appears uninterested in elaborating on tales of Aeneas, despite the tale's relevance to the Augustan ideology of his own time. By contrast, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing at roughly the same time, gives a much fuller treatment of the pre-Romulus era. He combed through a wide array of sources, especially Greek ones, and mentions no fewer than 14 different versions of Rome's foundation. Plutarch, too, describes 13 different explanations for the city's name. These multiple and sometimes contradictory stories reveal not chaos, but a vibrant and deep tradition of myth-making surrounding Rome's origins, one that was shaped by many hands over time. Greek interest in Rome's early history long predated the military or political conflicts of the later centuries. Even in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Greek writers and travelers were keenly aware of Rome and the surrounding Italian cultural landscape. Myths about Rome's earliest period often featured wandering Greek heroes, Trojan refugees, and exotic figures who roamed the Mediterranean after the fall of Troy. 3 of these stand out: Evander, Hercules, and Aeneas. Evander was said to have arrived in Italy from Arcadia and settled on the Palatine Hill before the arrival of Aeneas. He brought with him the arts, religion, and perhaps even writing. Hercules, on his return from stealing Gerion's cattle, defeated a local monster named Cacus, and was honored by Evander with a shrine. Aeneas, the most famous of these heroes, escaped from Troy carrying sacred religious objects. He traveled the Mediterranean, eventually landing in Latium, where he married into the ruling family and helped form the Latin people Lavinium and Alba Longa, were said to have been founded by Aeneas or his descendants. Such stories were not unique. Across the Mediterranean, Greek writers were spinning similar tales of city foundations linked to Trojan or Greek heroes. Figures like Odysseus and Diomedes were associated with various places in Latium and southern Italy. While these myths are often labeled as Greek, many of them weave together elements from different cultures, Greek, Italic, and Near Eastern alike, reflecting the complex interactions of the ancient Mediterranean world. Some of these myths are very old, with evidence showing they were circulating in Italy by the 8th century BC. The famous inscription on the so-called Cup of Nestor, found at Pithecusae, is a clear example. It quotes a line from Homer and shows that local communities were already engaging with Greek epic traditions. Other early references include Hesiod's mention of Latinus and the Tersenians, and Stesichorus's references to Evander. By the 5th century, Greek writers like Hellanicus and Hecataeus were including Rome in their works, sometimes blending myth and ethnography, sometimes recounting versions of Rome's foundation that are otherwise unknown. Aeneas, in particular, became a popular figure in local Italic traditions. His story appears on Etruscan pottery and small sculptures, especially in cities like Caere and Vulci. At Veii, statuettes of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises have been found in sanctuaries, suggesting a cultic presence. The precise role and origin of Aeneas worship remains debated, but it likely predates Roman appropriation during the Augustan age. Lavinium, too, holds a special place in the myth. Located on the coast south of Rome, it had a sanctuary and altar dedicated to Venus that may have served as an early meeting point for traders and travelers. An important local cult site with 13 altars and inscriptions linked to Greek deities like Castor and Pollux indicates lively cultural exchange. By the 3rd century BC, visitors like the historian Timaeus recorded Trojan legends at Lavinium. An ancient structure in the city, used for ritual from the 6th century onward, may have been seen as the tomb of Aeneas. While scholars still debate whether the cult of Aeneas began in Rome, Lavinium, or elsewhere, it is clear that his myth was part of a broader web of shared stories and symbols throughout central Italy. These legends were not static, but evolved alongside political and cultural developments, shaping and reshaping the way communities understood their past and identity. The myth of Aeneas likely found its place in Rome quite early, probably by the 6th century BC. This is suggested by the existence of Roman families who claimed Trojan ancestry, a lineage they must have invented before their decline in the late 4th century. In the 270s BC, Pyrrhus could evoke this myth to rally Greek support by framing his campaign against Rome as a continuation of the Trojan War. Though scholars differ on when exactly these myths took root, they clearly predate later literary references. Other myths, such as that of Hercules, whose cult is attested in the Forum Boreum by the 6th century, further demonstrate that Greek and Mediterranean lore was being woven into Roman culture early on. Similarly, the cult of Evander and his mother Carmenta, who had an ancient priesthood and festival, shows an early and deep integration of foreign mythological figures into Roman tradition. Terracotta decorations from temples like the Regia and Santo Mobono also reveal that these imported myths were reshaped to serve local purposes. Dionysius of Halicarnassus' account of Aeneas as a founder, possibly deriving from even earlier sources like Stesichorus, could reflect genuine Roman beliefs rather than purely Greek inventions. It is therefore clear that stories of Greek and Trojan heroes traveling west and settling in Italy circulated widely in central Italy from the early Archaic period onward. While it's difficult to pinpoint exact origins due to fragmentary evidence, these myths likely thrived in the vibrant cultural environment of the 8th and 9th centuries BC, when intense contact between Italy, Greece, and the Near East created fertile ground for shared storytelling. It would be simplistic to dismiss these early legends as later Greek fabrications imposed from outside, rather, They reflect a Mediterranean cultural exchange that predates the foundation of Rome and the standardization of Homeric epic. The idea that myths like those of Aeneas, Hercules, or Evander are Greek and therefore foreign to Rome ignores the fluidity of identities and themes in the ancient world. Greece was not the sole source of cultural authority. Myths were adapted, reshaped, and given new meanings by different communities. The role of these myths in Roman identity is complex. Traditionally, scholars have interpreted them as expressions of ethnic awareness, claiming Trojan descent as a way to distinguish Rome from Greek or Etruscan neighbors. But it may be more accurate to see them as reflections of Rome's multicultural origins, where Greek, Trojan, Etruscan, and other influences blended seamlessly. The Romans saw themselves as heirs to a tapestry of migrations, myths, and traditions. The city's topography even mirrored this, with different hills linked to different legendary founders. Evander on the Palatine, Hercules on the Capitoline, and Caelius Vibena on the Caelian Hill. Despite this mix, Romans did recognize distinctions, particularly in religion. For example, the cult of Hercules was worshipped following Greek rites, and the priestess of Ceres had to be Greek. Yet the inclusion of Aeneas and Evander in Roman religious and cultural life suggests a strong willingness to absorb and reinterpret foreign elements. These myths contribute not to a story of racial purity or conquest, but to one of layered, shared heritage, a foundation on which Rome built its enduring identity. The story of Romulus and Remus is one of the most memorable foundation myths in history. It has endured not only because of Rome's later importance, but also due to its dramatic and emotionally resonant details. The version widely accepted by the 1st century BC, recounted by writers like Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Plutarch, tells a compelling tale rooted in centuries of oral tradition. According to this version, Romulus and Remus were twin sons of Ilia, a Vestal virgin and daughter of Numitor, the rightful king of Alba Longa. Numitor was deposed by his brother Amulius, who forced Ilia into celibacy to prevent heirs. Despite this, she gave birth to twins. Allegedly fathered by Mars, Amulius ordered the infants to be drowned in the Tiber, but fate intervened. The basket carrying them ran aground near the Palatine Hill, at a place later called the Lupercal there. A she-wolf nursed them until they were found by a shepherd named Faustulus, who raised them with his wife. As young men, the twins gathered a band of exiles and fought to reclaim their grandfather's throne. After killing Amulius and restoring Numitor, they decided to found a new city at the place of their rescue. Romulus and Remus couldn't agree on the location. Romulus chose the Palatine, while Remus favored the Aventine. After a dispute over omens and sacred signs, Romulus began building his walls. In a symbolic challenge, Remus leaped over them and was killed, either in a scuffle or by Romulus himself, depending on the version. Thus, Rome took its name from Romulus. But this version was not the only one circulating in antiquity. Ancient writers, including Dionysius, Livy, Plutarch, and others, record numerous variations. Some claimed the twins were sons of Aeneas or his descendants. Others doubted the she-wolf entirely, suggesting she was a metaphor for Faustulus's wife, who may have been nicknamed Lupa, a slang term for prostitute. Even the circumstances of Remus's death varied. Livy says he died in a general riot, while others attribute it to a henchman named Celer. This variety is typical of myths passed down orally. They accumulate layers, contradictions, and dramatic elements reflecting shared narrative patterns. In this case, themes of divine conception, childhood rescue, animal caretakers, and brotherly conflict. These motifs appear in cultures across the ancient Mediterranean and Indo-European world, from Persia's Cyrus to heroes suckled by goats, bears, or wolves. In Greek and Near Eastern myths, the myth of Romulus and Remus was not uniquely Roman. Similar tales existed in neighboring cities like Praeneste, where Caculus, a foundling raised by shepherds, led a band of raiders before founding the city. In Etruria, art depicts infants suckled by animals, as seen in a grave stele from Bologna and a mirror from Bolsena, likely depicting the twins, which evidence suggests that this kind of myth was part of a broader Italic cultural framework. Scholars have tried to interpret the myth against political backdrops. Some, like Strasburger, argued it was invented by Rome's enemies during the Pyrrhic War of the 270s BC, pointing to fratricide and rape as anti-Roman propaganda. Wiseman proposed that Remus was added later as an allegory for the struggle between patricians and plebeians, only to be eliminated symbolically at the story's end. However, these interpretations rest on uncertain ground. Until recently, the Capitoline wolf statue was considered key evidence for the early existence of the myth. The bronze sculpture, depicting the wolf with full teats, was long thought to be Etruscan, dating to the 6th or 5th century BC. However, restoration in the late 1990s revealed that the statue was cast in a single piece using a method typically associated with medieval artisans. Scientific tests indicated the casting core may date between 100 and 1155 AD. This suggests the wolf is medieval, though the twins added beneath her are Renaissance. The legend itself, however, is far older, embedded deeply in the cultural memory of central Italy, and shaped over centuries by storytellers, dramatists, and historians. The debate over the dating of the Capitoline wolf statue has reopened questions about its origins and the timeline of Rome's foundational myths. In 2007, prominent archaeologists challenged the claim that the wolf statue is medieval, noting that the bronze's alloy composition aligns more with Etruscan craftsmanship than with medieval techniques, which often reused metal. Furthermore, the lead used in the statue appears to come from ancient Sardinian mines, not exploited during the Middle Ages. Still, scientific tests conducted in 2012 on organic materials inside the statue's cavity dated them to the 11th to 12th centuries AD, strongly suggesting a medieval origin. Yet scholars like Formigli have argued that the version we see now could be a medieval recasting of an earlier Etrusco-Italic original. While the statue no longer provides a reliable anchor for dating the myth of Romulus, it is still possible that similar imagery existed in archaic Rome. Despite these uncertainties, there is solid evidence that the Romulus myth was established in Roman culture by around 300 BC. The depiction of the wolf and twins appears on a mirror from Bolsena, and Livy records that a statue of Romulus and Remus suckling the wolf was installed in Rome in 296 BC by the Ogulni, then curule ediles. Shortly after, the image was adopted on Roman coinage in 269 BC. Earlier references also appear in Greek historical works, such as those of Alcimus and Callias, who describe alternative genealogies linking Romulus to Aeneas or Trojan women, suggesting that versions of this story were circulating outside Rome as well. The first full Roman account of the city's foundation seems to come from Fabius Pictor. Writing in the late 3rd century BC, he included the familiar sequence of myths: Evander, Hercules, Aeneas, Romulus, and Remus. and apparently drew heavily from a Greek historian, Diocles of Piparethus. This reliance on a Greek source highlights how deeply embedded these legends were in broader Mediterranean culture. It also suggests that Romans themselves were reshaping and recording their own stories under the influence of Greek frameworks and storytelling conventions. Common scholarly views have long seen the myth of Aeneas as a later Greek invention grafted onto an older, indigenous story of Romulus and Remus. However, this view faces challenges. The Aeneas myth is attested earlier in literary sources, and Pictor's account makes clear that both myths existed together by the 3rd century BC. In reality, these stories were likely evolving in parallel, drawing from shared cultural exchanges among Greeks, Etruscans, Latins, and others along the Tyrrhenian coast. The Romulus myth was not purely Roman in the modern sense. It reflected a Mediterranean world in which myths, artistic motifs, and religious practices circulated freely. The commonly accepted date for the founding of Rome, 753 BC, was itself a late and artificial calculation. Ancient sources present a wide range of dates, some linking the city's origins closely to the Trojan War, or placing Aeneas and Romulus in the same generation. Later historians attempted to reconcile these discrepancies, especially after Eratosthenes dated the fall of Troy to 1184 BC. They inserted an invented line of Alban kings connecting Aeneas to Romulus, allowing a neat distinction between mythic and historical time. By the mid-3rd century BC, Roman historians such as Fabius Pictor aligned the city's foundation with the 7th or 12th Olympiad, roughly the mid-8th century BC. Yet other writers, including Naevius and Ennius, ignored these calculations and placed Romulus just one generation after Aeneas. Ultimately, the chosen date may reflect Rome's effort to situate itself within a broader Mediterranean timeframe. The city's founding became not just a local tradition, but part of a wider narrative shared with Greece, the Near East, and the entire ancient world. The story of Rome's first king, Romulus, contains several distinctive and intriguing elements. Both Romulus and his twin brother Remus are portrayed as young shepherds raised on the outskirts of society. They lived among other youths and were cared for by Faustulus, the keeper of the royal flocks. One notable episode involves Remus being captured during the Lupercalia, an ancient festival linked with rustic traditions, goat sacrifices, and animal skins. This festival was said to predate Rome's founding and was associated with the Arcadian heritage of Evander, reflecting cultural connections with Greek myths. Though the pastoral setting might seem like a romanticized motif, similar themes recur in many ancient foundation stories, where founders often spend time in isolation, living in liminal spaces like mountains, before stepping into their destined roles. Once Romulus established his authority, he set about populating the new city through unconventional methods. He famously created an asylum on the Capitoline Hill, a place where refugees and fugitives could seek sanctuary. This attracted people of humble origins, including runaway slaves. The idea echoes later Roman policies, such as those attributed to Servius Tullius, who granted citizenship to freed slaves. These myths show how Rome imagined itself as a society built by outsiders, and seen similarly in Greek foundation myths, where exiles and adventurers often play central roles. Another foundational event is the abduction of the Sabine women. In this myth, Romulus, unable to secure wives from neighboring cities, invited their people to a festival. Under this guise, the Romans seized the women, creating conflict with the Sabines. The story ends with a dramatic resolution. The Sabine women, now wives and mothers, intervene to stop the fighting and forge peace between their husbands and fathers. This tale not only explains Rome's ethnically mixed origins, but also reinforces the role of women in binding different peoples together. Romulus's reign ends mysteriously. Some traditions claim he was taken up into the heavens and became the god Quirinus, while others recount that he was murdered by senators who hid his dismembered body under their cloaks. These conflicting versions reflect the myth's oral roots and may hint at later political interpretations, possibly influencing Roman attitudes during the turbulent late Republic. The story of Romulus's death could have served as a warning about tyrannical leaders or justified the actions of political reformers. Romulus is credited with establishing many of Rome's core institutions. According to ancient sources, like Dionysius, he laid out the city's defenses, built temples such as that of Jupiter Feretrius, and created key social and political structures. These included dividing the population into patricians and plebeians and establishing the patronage system. Romulus also organized the people into 3 tribes and 30 curiae, appointed a senate of 100 members, and formed a royal guard called the Celeres. Although some details, such as the patrician-plebeian divide, likely evolved over time, the division into tribes and curiae corresponds to institutions that persisted into later centuries. Each of the 3 tribes, Tities, Ramnes, and Luceres, had its own identity and likely predated the later reforms of Servius Tullius. These tribes were further subdivided into curiae, each with its own meeting place and religious functions. They played a role in festivals and maintained political responsibilities through the Comitia Curiata, which conferred power upon magistrates and approved appointments to priestly offices. Modern research tends to treat the Romulus tradition less as a coded historical record and more as a reflection of how the Romans viewed their own origins. One striking feature is the complete lack of shame about the humble background of the city's early population and the dramatic episode of abducting the Sabine women. This suggests an early myth shaped by oral storytelling rather than a polished narrative designed to glorify Rome. While the 3 original tribal divisions do not represent literal racial groups, the stories of the asylum and the Sabine women clearly show an awareness of early ethnic diversity and the presence of outsiders, something supported by archaeology and inscriptions. A central part of the story is the orderly civic structure attributed to Romulus. This does not require us to accept him as a historical figure or to assume that such a founder lived in the mid-8th century. What matters is that many of these institutions seem genuinely archaic. Comparable systems appear in early Greek cities, where divisions such as phylae and phratries mirror Rome's tribes and curiae. The Roman versions must be very old, since they were largely overtaken by new reforms in the 6th century. Scholars debate their origins, some placing them after Rome became urban in the 7th century, while others argue that the curiae may have existed before the traditional date of the city's foundation. Older scholarship saw these early civic structures as proof of Greek influence. The idea was that only Greek-style city-states used such systematic divisions, unlike Italic or Etruscan communities. Yet the evidence for Etruscan and Italic political organization is thin, and what survives suggests that similar arrangements did exist elsewhere. Some Umbrian and Etruscan settlements show comparable tribal and curial structures, and Roman writers even claim that Etruscans possessed ritual texts explaining how to divide a city into tribes. It is now widely accepted that Rome's system was shaped by local Latin traditions, regional interaction, and broader Mediterranean practices, rather than by a single cultural model. The Roman monarchy is traditionally said to have lasted from 753 to 509 BC, with 7 kings ruling for an average of 35 years each. This pattern looks artificial and likely results from later chronological calculation rather than preserved memory. Ancient scholars probably worked backwards from the familiar date of the Republic's beginning and imposed a neat sequence of 7 rulers. The result is historically implausible, especially since several kings supposedly died violently, yet still average extraordinarily long reigns. Attempts to correlate their lives with known events, such as the rise of the Cypselids in Corinth, expose further inconsistencies. If the reign lengths are unreliable, major difficulties arise. The kings cannot be matched securely to archaeological phases, and the tradition clearly underwent major distortion over time. One response is to assume that the monarchy started later, in the 7th century, when archaeological evidence shows urban development. Another is to accept that more kings once existed and were removed from the official list. Many scholars prefer this second explanation, but even then the literary material remains uneven. The early rulers, Romulus as founding hero, Numa as priest-king, and Tullus as warlike counterpart, are almost symbolic figures. Only with Ancus Marcius and the last 3 kings do we encounter characters who seem historically plausible. Their names are consistent, their order stable, and their actions more credible. It is therefore likely that the later kings were real figures, while the earliest ones took shape within myth, representing broad cultural memories rather than precise biography. The idea of Roman kingship is widely regarded as a genuine memory of early Roman society. Across literary traditions, the monarchy is consistently described, and similar systems are known to have existed in other central Italian communities. For example, historical records from places like Clusium and Caere mention kings such as Lars Porsena and Orgulnius. In Rome itself, inscriptions provide contemporary evidence. A Bucero cup from the late 6th century bears the word rex, and a 6th century stone inscription contains the form risi, both pointing to a living institution of kingship. Later religious practices also reference the king, such as the Regifugium, Flight of the King, and a festival marked by the cryptic note QRCF, meaning the day is favorable when the king has held the assembly. While some argue these references might point to the priestly figure of the Rex Sacrorum, the evidence more convincingly points to the memory of an actual monarch. The continued use of the interregnum, literally between kings, during the Republic also supports this view. Stories from the monarchy describe a consistent process for choosing new kings. Though details are preserved in a legendary context, this process seems too incidental to be invented later. After Romulus's disappearance, the tradition says Rome endured a full year without a king, managed by a rotating group of senators. Each senator held power for 12 hours at a time, wearing royal symbols and performing sacred rites. This system, known as the interregnum, preserved stability until a new king could be selected. The procedure involved an elite-controlled nomination, ratified by the Comitia Curiata in a formal but probably symbolic vote. The existence of the interregnum as a republican office under different conditions suggests that it may have evolved from a genuine regal-era practice. Most of Rome's kings, according to tradition, were not native Romans but outsiders. Numa Pompilius came from Sabine territory. Tullus Hostilius was Latin. Tarquinius Priscus had mixed Etruscan and Greek heritage. The pattern of importing rulers may reflect a political strategy to avoid factionalism among local elites. Often, the incoming king married into the previous royal family, further legitimizing their authority. This consistent outsider pattern may mirror broader Mediterranean customs, where supreme power is given to external figures to preserve internal balance. The narrative becomes more coherent from the reign of Tarquinius Priscus onward. These later kings appear less mythic and more plausible as historical figures. The emergence of figures like Aulus Vibenna and the early Valeri in epigraphic records supports this shift. Developments in this period align with larger Mediterranean trends, such as the rise of tyrants, the mobilization of popular support, and the use of divine signs to validate power. Yet, problems persist. The sources remain intensely focused on royal biographies rather than on the community or political structures. Compared with the early republic, the monarchy's narrative is dominated by courtly intrigues and individual kings. The relative uniformity of accounts could be misleading. It might reflect a narrowing of sources rather than improved historical accuracy. Some non-Roman sources, particularly Etruscan ones, likely offered different perspectives, but these seem to have had minimal influence on the mainstream Roman tradition. As a result, key events, especially during the transition to the Republic, are told in overly neat versions. Legends like the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus mask a more complex reality, one that likely involved upheaval, shifting power centers, and foreign intervention, as hinted by alternative traditions about Lars Porsenna's role in Roman history. The legends surrounding Rome's last kings are filled with fantastical elements, typical of stories shaped by long oral traditions. Servius Tullius, for example, is said in some accounts to have been conceived by the god Vulcan in the form of a flaming phallus from the hearth. Another story tells of a halo of fire around his head as a child, marking him as destined for greatness. He is also said to have enjoyed a special relationship with the goddess Fortuna. These striking details likely evolved through repeated retelling, lending a mythical quality to the narrative. Many scholars have noted the dramatic tone of the stories about the House of the Tarquins, which features unusually prominent female characters for early Roman narratives. This suggests a potential link to theatrical traditions. For instance, the poet Axius wrote a play about Brutus in 133 BC that dealt with the fall of the Tarquins. Poetry and drama may have helped preserve and adapt these legends, though it's likely that oral traditions, monuments, and civic rituals continued to play a central role in keeping these stories alive. Still, the specific political and constitutional changes attributed to figures like Servius Tullius often seem too detailed to have originated solely in drama or poetry. Servius himself is a particularly intriguing figure, not only in myth, but also in historical reconstructions. Roman accounts portray him as the son of a noblewoman named Ocresia from Corniculum, who was captured during war. In a dramatic version, she becomes pregnant when instructed to lie with a phallic apparition in the flames, and the resulting child, Servius, is recognized for his divine potential when his head is seen encircled by fire while he sleeps. Other versions have him as the son of a slave in the royal household, or even a former slave himself. A very different perspective is provided by Etruscan sources, notably in a speech by the Emperor Claudius, preserved on the Bronze Table of Lions. In this version, Servius Tullius, whose original name was Mastarna, was not born in Rome at all. He is described as a loyal companion of Caelius Vibena, a legendary Etruscan leader. When political change forced them from their homeland, Mastarna and his followers are said to have settled on the Caelian Hill in Rome, which he named after Vibena, and later became king. Archaeological evidence supports this version. A fresco in the Francois tomb at Volci, dating to the 4th century BC, shows Mastarna freeing Caelius Vibena and others from captivity, closely mirroring the story Claudius relates. In this scene, one of the defeated figures is labeled Gnaeus Tarquinius of Rome, suggesting that Mastarna may have taken power through a violent struggle. The fresco also includes a parallel scene from Greek myth, where Achilles executes Trojan prisoners at Patroclus' funeral. Some scholars have connected these two scenes, suggesting they symbolize a clash between local Etruscan heroes and external forces, possibly including Romans. However, the identities of the defeated figures are varied, hinting instead at a broader picture of mixed communities caught in conflict during the Archaic period. Additional evidence adds historical weight to the stories connected with figures like Aulus Vibena and Servius Tullius. An inscription on a Bucaro cup from Veii, dating to around 580 BC, mentions Aulus Vibena, likely the same person depicted as the brother of Caelius Vibena in later traditions. This dating aligns with the literary time frame for the events associated with Servius Fabius Pictor, through the later author Arnobius, mentions an Aulus Volcentanus killed by a slave and links his head to the origins of the Capitolium's name. Although Varro mistakenly associates him with Romulus, these stories suggest the Vibena brothers were real 6th century figures whose exploits were later mythologized in Etruscan culture. Claudius's account of Servius Tullius as Mastarna, an Etruscan adventurer associated with the Vibenai, draws on Etruscan traditions dating back at least to the 4th century BC, as evidenced by the Francois tomb fresco at Volci. In this fresco, Mastarna is shown freeing Caelius Vibena and others from captivity, supporting the idea of a real leader whose story was adapted into Rome's narrative. If Claudius's version is accurate, it challenges the traditional Roman narrative, possibly based on misinterpretation of Servius' name, and suggests that Servius was another outsider king, further highlighting the fluid ethnic and political landscape of archaic central Italy. Alternatively, if Claudius confused Mastarna with Servius, it hints at the existence of an additional king, complicating the chronology of the monarchy. These stories underline the mobility and interconnectedness of early Italic and Etruscan elites. Cities like Rome, Tarquini, and Veii saw fluid movement of individuals between them, often driven by personal ambition, exile, or strategic alliances. Epigraphic evidence confirms the presence of Etruscans in key Roman religious and civic spaces, like Sant'Umobono, and the capital Greeks and Phoenicians also moved freely in the region, contributing to a diverse and cosmopolitan environment. The stories of figures like Tarquinius, Priscus, and Servius, regardless of their precise truth, reflect this cultural mobility and include structural parallels to Homeric hospitality and guest friendship. The ascents of Tarquinius, Priscus, and Servius Tullius both show similar patterns. Each became a trusted advisor to the ruling king, then succeeded him, only to later be killed by rivals connected to the previous royal line. This suggests a system in which outsiders could become kings through marriage into the royal family, aided by influential women like Tanaquil and Tullia, who acted as political catalysts. This may point to a system of matrilineal succession, also seen in Greek myth and other anthropological examples. The final three kings of Rome are portrayed as rulers whose legitimacy was more fragile. Their accessions did not follow the traditional interregnum procedures, indicating a shift toward more autocratic or tyrannical rule, similar to Greek tyrannies of the period. They relied on personal retinues, manipulated the Senate, and sought support from the populace over the aristocracy, behaviors characteristic of leaders like Pisistratus in Athens. While elements of these narratives may echo later political events, they now seem more likely to reflect real structural similarities with Greek practices of the 6th century BC. This so-called Tarquin dynasty appears as a mix of historical and literary elements. Its figures are likely real, their ordering roughly correct, but the timeline is stretched and inconsistent. It is also evident that the dynasty included outsiders who secured power through marriages to royal daughters, linking key figures like Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, possibly Mastarna, and Tarquinius Superbus into a fluid and dynamic political web. Among the most significant contributions attributed to Servius Tullius are his organizational reforms, especially the restructuring of Rome's army and citizen body. He is credited with dividing citizens into territorial tribes and economic classes, each with military and voting responsibilities. The wealthier classes contributed more troops and had greater political weight through the centuriate assembly, while ancient sources like Livy and Dionysius present a detailed picture of this system. Modern scholars regard parts of it as later reconstructions, especially the monetary values and standardized equipment, which seem anachronistic for the 6th century BC. Nonetheless, the core structure appears archaic and credible, connecting military service, political rights, and wealth in a way consistent with developments in Greek city-states of the same era. Despite doubts about the precise details, the general framework of Servius's reforms, linking military function to political authority and dividing citizens based on wealth and residence, fits the pattern of early urban state development. Even if later historians idealized or systematized his reforms, they reflect a real and transformative period in Rome's early history, shaped by cultural exchange, social mobility, and political innovation. Many scholars today are less interested in squeezing hidden facts out of the stories about the early Roman kings, and more interested in what these tales reveal about how the Romans saw themselves. One striking feature is that the tradition shows no shame at all about the humble background of Rome's first citizens, or about episodes like the asylum and the rape of the Sabine women. Rather than being a polished piece of propaganda, the legend feels like an old, dramatic story that the Romans kept retelling, even though it did not always cast them in a flattering light. The three-way division of the early community into tribes and curiae is no longer seen as a literal reflection of three separate races merging into Rome, but the myths of the asylum and the Sabine women do show a clear awareness that the city's population was ethnically mixed from the start. This matches what we see in archaeology and inscriptions, which point to a strong presence of Sabines and other outsiders in the formative stages of Roman history. Central to the legend is the image of Romulus as a rational organizer of the city. Whether or not Romulus himself ever existed, and regardless of whether we place him in the mid-8th century or not, the institutions attributed to him look genuinely archaic. Similar arrangements exist in early Greek city-states, where population groups were divided into tribes and subgroups that carried political, religious, and military functions. In Rome, the 3 tribes and 30 curiae must be very old, as they were later overshadowed by the centuriate organization attributed to Servius Tullius in the 6th century. Scholars disagree on the exact date of their creation, but most link them to the moment when Rome began to function as a true urban center, rather than a loose collection of hilltop settlements. The parallels with Greek practice once encouraged some historians to see direct Greek influence, but the evidence from Italy and Etruria now suggests that similar subdivision systems emerged locally as well, and that Rome was part of a broader Central Italian pattern. A major figure in this process is Servius Tullius, who was remembered as the second founder of the city because of his sweeping reorganization of Roman society and the army. According to the literary tradition, he divided citizens by residence into tribes and by wealth into classes, each with its own military obligations. These classes were further split into centuries, which served as the basic voting units of the centuriate assembly. The richer a citizen was, the better equipped he was expected to be in war, and the more weight his century's vote had in public decisions. The detailed figures given in the ancient texts for the monetary thresholds and equipment are almost certainly later reconstructions, adjusted to a world that already knew coined money and a more rigid military structure. Yet many historians accept that property qualifications expressed in bronze weight could well have existed in the 6th century, even before coinage, and that a system linking wealth, military service, and political influence did take shape under the monarchy. Modern reconstructions often prefer a simplified model, in which Servius distinguished only between those who qualified as heavy infantry and those below that level. But the ancient antiquarian evidence points in another direction. Old Roman scholars clearly believed that multiple classes and centuries already existed under the kings, even if the system may initially have been smaller and less elaborate than the version known in the late Republic. When we also consider the wider Mediterranean context, where complex timocratic systems were already in use in Greek cities by the early 6th century, it becomes easier to accept that Rome could have developed a multi-class structure at a similarly early stage. The reforms attributed to Servius fit the monarchy better than the later Republic, both because they presuppose a strong central figure capable of imposing a new order, and because they match the picture of a city that had just built a defensive wall and was consolidating itself as a unified political and military community. The key purpose of this new organization was not to diminish the power of the elite, but to strengthen the capacity of the state. By tying military duty to voting power, the system rewarded those who bore the heaviest burdens in war and integrated them more tightly into the political framework. At the same time, the regular census that underpinned the centuriate system allowed newcomers to be absorbed into the citizen body and assigned to their proper place in both army and assembly. This was especially important in a period of rapid demographic growth and constant movement of people, when migrants, allies, and former outsiders were continually joining the Roman community. Over time, the census came to be repeated at regular intervals, especially in the 5th century, in order to adjust for population changes, territorial gains or losses, and the casualties of war. In this light, the reforms linked to Servius Tullius appear as a response to expansion and mobility, rather than a rigid attempt to freeze society in place. The stories about his ambiguous origins, whether as a Latin of low status or an Etruscan adventurer, mirror the wider reality of a city shaped by migrants, war bands, and shifting alliances. The centuriate system gave this fluid world a structured framework, channeling diverse populations into a coherent military and political order. Even if we can no longer reconstruct every detail of the original scheme, the main outlines, a monarchy that oversaw a relatively sophisticated classification of citizens by wealth, residence, and military role, are consistent with what we know of Rome's urban development and with broader trends across the archaic Mediterranean. Despite the compelling drama of Rome's transition from monarchy to republic, the traditional narrative is riddled with challenges. The stories are heavily shaped by patriotic ideals, painting early Romans as heroes of exceptional virtue and resolve. Characters like Lucretia, who emerges almost solely to embody the perfect Roman victim, serve as symbols of moral resistance. Her suicide after being assaulted becomes the spark that propels Lucius Junius Brutus into action, casting him as the somber liberator of Rome. Brutus, supposedly willing to sacrifice even his own sons for the Republic's ideals, stands as the embodiment of Stoic patriotism. Alongside him, figures like Horatius Cocles, who is said to have single-handedly defended a bridge against the Etruscans, and Mucius Scaevola, who allegedly burned his own hand in defiance after a failed assassination attempt, form a powerful gallery of legendary Roman courage. Even Cloelia, a woman, is elevated to hero status for bravely escaping captivity with fellow hostages. These tales, likely formed through generations of oral tradition, carry strong moral lessons, but are highly stylized, perhaps even mythologized, and may have been reinforced by monuments or traditional plays. There are also serious inconsistencies, especially concerning the role of the Etruscan king Porsenna. While the main sources depict him as withdrawing peacefully after a failed siege, some later writers offer a very different version. Tacitus claims that Rome actually surrendered, and Pliny mentions a treaty that strictly limited Rome's use of iron to farming tools. It's possible that early Roman historians glossed over this humiliation, reworking the narrative into a story of noble resistance. The timeline of the political shift is also questionable. Rather than a sudden revolution in 509 BCE, it's more plausible that Rome underwent a gradual transformation. Evidence such as the existence of a priestly rex sacrorum, a king of sacred rites, suggests the stripping of religious powers from the monarchy before the fall. Terms like praetor and praetor maximus hint at a transitional period where the chief magistrate was not yet a consul, but held something like dictatorial authority. Similar patterns can be seen in nearby cities, where kings were replaced by dictators or leaders serving multi-year terms without abandoning the trappings of monarchy. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of a complex and unstable period in late 6th century Rome. Around 525 BCE, elite houses on the Palatine suggest the rise of a wealthy ruling class. Meanwhile, several important religious and political buildings, such as the Regia and Atrium Vestae, were destroyed and rebuilt in the decades around 500 BCE. These changes imply political upheaval rather than an orderly transition. The rebuilding of the Comitium, with new steps and paving, suggests that public assemblies continued to be a central feature, and that Rome. This reinterpretation also fits a wider pattern across the Mediterranean. Around 500 BCE, many regions were experiencing political upheaval. In Sicily and Magna Graecia, tyrannies were expanding. In contrast, Rome's path toward a republic may have been influenced by temporary crises in Mediterranean trade networks, shifts in Greek and Carthaginian power, and pressure from new military threats. Events such as the failure of an Etruscan attack on Cumae in 524 and the destruction of Sybaris in 510 disrupted traditional networks, perhaps pushing Rome and its neighbors to reorganize their political systems. Viewed this way, Rome's transformation was less a singular moment of national awakening and more a response to wider geopolitical currents and internal tensions that eventually crystallized into a republican form of governance. Central Italy underwent significant urban development at the end of the second and the beginning of the first millennium BCE, and Rome was part of this transformative period. Although excavation challenges still prevent a fully coherent picture, recent archaeological findings have greatly enriched our understanding of early Rome. This period reveals a community shaped by burial practices, domestic structures, and defensive works, with progressive discoveries shedding light on the city's origins and early expansion. The story begins around 1000 BCE, with evidence of sustained settlement near the future heart of Rome. Excavations on the Capitoline Hill, particularly in the Giardino Romano area, show continuous habitation from the late Bronze Age pottery fragments, building traces, metalworking debris, and evidence of terracing point to a stable population with access to the Tiber River. This location, near a bend in the river and adjacent to a natural crossing, was key. Not only did it connect Rome to regions like Sabinum and Etruria, but it also offered access to trade routes, a food source, and strategic control over movement between the coast and inland territories. Here, the Tiber was more than a river. It was a lifeline that positioned Rome as a hub from its earliest days. Rome's geography further influenced its development. Unlike many other early Italian settlements built on defensible plateaus, Rome arose across several hills divided by streams and marshy land. These hills, including the Capitoline, Palatine, and Aventine, were originally more rugged and uneven than they appear today. Between them lay areas like the Velabrum and the Forum, regularly flooded by the Tiber before later human intervention raised the land level. Despite the challenges of marshland and flooding, these areas were rich in resources such as clay and stone, supporting trade and production. The region also benefited from its position along ancient routes used for trade and seasonal movement. One vital corridor ran between the salt flats near the river mouth and the mountainous interior. This link, strengthened when settlers likely built the earliest wooden bridge, the Pons Sublicius, helped Rome to control the supply of salt, a precious commodity for preservation and livestock. Habitation expanded in stages. The earliest cemeteries are significant markers of community identity and cultural development. The Sepulchretum Cemetery, discovered near the Via Sacra, dates to around 1000 BCE and contains funerary jars with cremated remains and miniature vessels. This cemetery, likely associated with settlements on the Capitoline and Palatine hills, suggests social organization and ritual practices from early on. In contrast, a later necropolis on the Esquiline Hill shows elite burials from the 8th and 7th centuries, including grave goods such as Greek pottery and military equipment, hinting at increasing wealth and status distinctions within the community. The remains of early habitation in Rome reveal structures traditionally called huts, though this term may not do them justice. Archaeological evidence, including post holes, rain channels, hearths, and traces of wattle and daub walls, shows they were solid, permanent buildings, often with multiple rooms. These wooden-framed structures could endure for over a century, indicating that the communities who built them were settled rather than nomadic models based on cinerary hut urns, show doors, geometric wall decoration, and decorative roof elements, suggesting a thoughtful approach to design and construction. Groups of these early homes have been found throughout central Rome. The most notable cluster lies on the southwestern slope of the Palatine Hill, dated to the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. This aligns intriguingly with the later Roman tradition that associated this part of the Palatine with the legendary home of Romulus, whose hut was preserved into imperial times. Excavations in the area also revealed a large wooden structure built between 900 and 750 BCE, which was later expanded into more complex multi-room dwellings. Similar habitation sites appear across the Forum area, particularly near the Regia and other sacred or political sites. Some smaller structures may have served as animal pens, especially those destroyed during a flood around 650 BCE. These structures, dated from the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, represent a transitional phase in Rome's development. Over time, their materials and techniques evolve into more labor-intensive methods, including stone foundations and tiled roofs. Yet, the social pattern likely remained consistent. People gathered around shared open spaces, altars, and hearths, just as they would in later cities. Alongside these homes, the cemeteries paint a picture of evolving urban unity. Early burials clustered on higher ground, such as the Sepulchratum, suggest a network of separate settlements that eventually converged. When burial activity shifted to the Esquiline and Quirinal hills in the mid-8th century, it signaled an expansion of habitation and an end to funerary activity inside what was becoming Rome's civic center. This shift marks a step toward urban consolidation, a city with defined boundaries and communal space. Excavations on the Palatine slopes have revealed remains of early public and ritual buildings, including a major wall dated to around 730 to 720 BCE. This wall, reconstructed twice over the next 160 years, may have enclosed or symbolically marked an important area. Nearby, a multi-room building known as the Domus Regia also appears in the late 8th century, suggesting early administrative or ceremonial functions. Roads made of clay conglomerate began to define the city's space around this time, marking a significant moment in its urban formation. Interpretations of these discoveries vary. Some scholars link the Palatine Wall to legendary accounts of Romulus fortifying the settlement, seeing this period as the birth of the city itself. Others are more cautious, questioning whether the wall was defensive or symbolic, and noting that burials found nearby complicate a straightforward reading. It remains uncertain whether the 8th century BCE witnessed a true urban foundation or simply a critical phase in a long process of transformation. Archaeological discoveries reveal a vivid picture of Rome transforming from a collection of settlements into a politically organized urban center. This change is clearest in the development of the Forum, a vast rectangular area nestled between Rome's main hills, which became the heart of both civic and commercial life. Of particular importance is the Comitium, the central assembly space that later came to embody aspects of Roman democracy. Despite its later associations with republican governance, the area's origins trace back to the period of monarchy, suggesting that assemblies played a key role in Roman political life from a very early stage. This early assembly may not have functioned as a voting body, but likely served as a place where the king could consult the people, test opinions, and perform political theater, similar to the assemblies described in Homeric epics. Advancements in archaeological techniques over recent decades, especially core sampling, have reshaped our understanding of how this area was created. Early excavations revealed that the Forum's ground level had been raised by several meters over centuries. Beneath the final paving of the imperial era lies a series of 28 earlier layers, showing that the ground was artificially built up numerous times Coring results indicate that this valley was originally only slightly above the riverbed of the Tiber, with much of it just 6 meters above sea level. Given that the river regularly flooded up to 9 meters in winter and spring, the area would have been swampy and uninhabitable until it was intentionally raised. This was achieved by massive earth-moving projects, which brought in tens of thousands of cubic meters of fill from surrounding hills. The sheer scale of the labor points to a high degree of organization and coordination, likely overseen by the king. Exactly when the Forum was first paved remains a subject of scholarly debate, with estimated dates ranging from the late 8th to the early 6th century BCE. Some argue that the first true paving of the Comitium dates to around 650 BCE. Others suggest an earlier date, around 700 to 650 BCE, based on beaten floors, hearth remains, and ceramic finds. Whatever the case, the groundwork that allowed the Forum to function as a public space was likely established in the 7th century. This may have coincided with increasing trade, evidenced by activity at the nearby clay beds of the Velebrum and the need for a marketplace for goods arriving via the Tiber. These developments signal more than urban growth. They point to political maturity. In earlier decades, scholars debated whether Rome's rise was due to a sudden unification or gradual expansion from an original nucleus on the Palatine. In reality, the formation of the city likely involved both processes along different timelines. By the late 8th century BCE, Rome had already achieved a level of political organization sufficient to carry out large-scale public works like the Forum's reclamation. This transformation set the stage for a monumental building boom in the following century. New techniques, stone foundations, terracotta tiled roofs, and sturdy timber frames made public architecture more visible and enduring. Although not all buildings survive in both text and archaeology, the overall picture is unambiguous. By the 6th century BCE, Rome was rapidly becoming a sophisticated urban center adorned with temples, public assembly spaces, and monumental structures. One of the earliest monumental buildings identified in the Forum is connected to the Comitium. A series of architectural terracottas, including a Gorgon antefix and decorative plaques featuring animals and riders, have been dated to around 590 to 580 BCE. These elements likely belonged to one of the first public buildings on the site, possibly the Curia Hostilia, attributed in tradition to the king Tullus Hostilius. Whether that attribution is historically accurate remains uncertain, but the archaeological evidence alone confirms a major architectural and political development: the birth of Rome's civic heart. At the southeastern edge of the Forum, one of Rome's earliest monumental buildings began to take shape around 620 BCE. This structure, later known as the Regia, was built with stone foundations and featured a tiled roof decorated with striking horn-shaped ornaments. Over the next few decades, the building evolved through several construction phases. By around 590 to 580 BCE, it had expanded into a multi-room complex with a central courtyard, resembling large palace structures known from other Etruscan sites, like Murlo and Aquarossa. The roof and walls were adorned with rich terracotta decorations, disc-shaped ornaments, fierce Gorgon faces, and plaques featuring birds, lions, and even a minotaur. These artistic details matched similar works found on the Capitoline Hill, as well as in other regions of Latium and Campania, showing the growing influence of Roman craftsmanship during this period. Many of these pieces were made with clay from the Velebrum region, suggesting that Rome became a center for producing and exporting terracotta work. along with skilled artisans. These artistic connections reflect the wider network of cultural exchange linking Rome to other coastal cities, like Cumae, where Roman kings would later seek refuge beyond the Forum. New evidence shows a shift toward larger and more elaborate buildings across Rome and central Italy during the 7th century BCE. In the area known as the Sepulchretum, a substantial building was uncovered, featuring walls made of squared tufa blocks and a plastered exterior, evidence of a strong timber-supported roof covered in tiles. These structures were a significant step forward from earlier wooden and mud-built dwellings. Another major area of development was the Forum Boarium, located beside the Tiber between the Capitoline and Aventine hills. This zone served as Rome's river landing point and had a cosmopolitan character from early on, marked by the presence of Greek pottery imported by traders as early as the 8th century BCE. It was also home to the earliest cult of Hercules in the city. Although no early altar has survived, the ritual remains, and sacrificial traces found there indicate intense religious activity by the late 7th century. Around 580 BCE, Rome saw the construction of its first temple, not only for the city, but for central Italy as a whole. This temple, built at the Forum Boarium, stood on a raised platform high enough to avoid frequent flooding. Its square design included a columned porch and a central cella with an altar at its front. The roof featured sculptural terracotta panels, including a dramatic pediment scene with 2 lions flanking a central Gorgon figure. Similar decorative themes appear in Greek temples from Corcyra and Syracuse, suggesting that Rome was engaging in artistic exchanges with the wider Mediterranean world. These elements have led some historians to draw connections between the temple's symbolism and the influence of the Bacchiads, a noble Corinthian family tied to the early Roman monarchy. The presence of Greek mythological motifs in this gateway to the city, such as Medusa and Pegasus, shows how Rome was beginning to absorb Greek cultural elements during its formative years. Around 530 BCE, the temple underwent renovation. The new phase introduced a more sophisticated decorative style, featuring sculpted plaques with female heads, lion spouts, and processions of warriors and charioteers. The roofline was crowned by a dramatic sculptural group of Hercules, being accompanied by Minerva, an image that reflected both a divine ascent and a blending of local and Greek religious imagery. The craftsmanship suggests that Greek artisans and their apprentices were working in Rome during this period. This temple likely stood alongside a second sanctuary on the same platform, hinting at a twin temple layout. Attempts to match these temples with traditional accounts of kings, like Servius Tullius or Tarquinius Superbus, have proven difficult, as the dates and details of these reigns are uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the temple's style and decoration were shared with other cities in Etruria and Latium. This demonstrates how Rome was part of a broader cultural and artistic movement in central Italy, rather than an isolated center. By the end of the 6th century BCE, both early temples were destroyed by fire. When the site was rebuilt in the early 5th century, it was transformed again. A massive platform was constructed using fill that contained relics from earlier phases, including Bronze Age pottery. 2 new temples rose from this elevated foundation, dramatically dominating the view from the river and forming one of central Italy's most impressive religious complexes at the time. While the temple at the Forum Boarium reveals how early Rome engaged with the wider Mediterranean world, it pales in comparison to the monumental scale of the Capitoline Temple, dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. This colossal structure, built atop the Capitoline Hill, became one of the most important religious and political landmarks in Roman history. Its dimensions and design remained largely unchanged from its construction at the end of the 6th century BCE until the fall of the Roman Empire, enduring 3 major reconstructions after devastating fires in 83 BCE, 69 CE, and 80 CE. Ancient writers described the temple as a massive and ambitious project that demanded immense labor and resources. It was traditionally said to have been vowed during a war with the Sabines by King Tarquinius Priscus, organized by Tarquinius Superbus, and dedicated soon after the establishment of the Republic. Detailed accounts, especially from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, paint a clear picture of its design. A nearly square base supported a deep porch with 3 rows of columns, and behind them stood 3 cella, central chambers, dedicated to Jupiter in the center, Minerva on the right, and Juno on the left. The temple's roof was crowned with a dramatic terracotta statue of a 4-horse chariot driven by Jupiter, crafted by the renowned Etruscan sculptor Vulca of Veii. Over the centuries, the decoration evolved with bronze replacements and new religious features added. Modern archaeological work has greatly enriched our understanding of this iconic structure. Although the massive Capellaccio stone foundation has been known for centuries, recent excavations uncovered over 1,000 fragments of terracotta tiles and architectural decorations that likely originated from the temple itself. These pieces span several periods, showing changes and repairs from the late 6th century to the early 3rd century BCE. These finds help confirm the traditional dating of the temple to the reign of Tarquinius Superbus. The excavation of the platform revealed that the temple measured approximately 54 meters in width and between 62 to 74 meters in length, depending on which reconstruction one follows. The massive foundation was built using intersecting ashlar walls, cleverly designed with voids to reduce weight, where the weight of the superstructure did not need direct support. The temple's plan shows that the walls and columns rested on these supporting surfaces, meeting the architectural challenge of a vast roof span, about 10.5 meters between the central columns, likely achieved using wooden truss technology that was already in use across central Italy. The exact length of the building continues to be debated. Some scholars favor a nearly square plan of about 62 meters long, matching Dionysius's account. Others argue for a longer structure at 74 meters, based on later found remains extending beyond the main substructure. The question hinges on whether these remains were part of the temple or part of another structure. Despite the debate, both reconstructions suggest a building of a scale far beyond anything else known in central Italy at the time. Architecturally, the temple echoed trends seen in the major Ionian temples of Athens, Samos, and Ephesus, as well as the monumental temples of Sicily. The triple row of columns at the front, for instance, created a powerful visual impression, similar to Greek designs. Even the substructure resembles that of Greek temples, such as the Heraion at Samos. Fragments found near the foundation offer additional clues. For example, a terracotta frieze decorated with anthemion motifs, typical of Ionian design, was likely part of the temple's decorative scheme. This supports the idea that Greek architects or designers were directly involved in the project. The Capitoline Temple showcases a mix of local and Mediterranean influences, while the triple tela arrangement and terracotta decorations reflect Etruscan and Latial traditions. The temple's size and technical sophistication connect it to the broader world of archaic architecture. The deities worshipped within, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, also show this blending. These gods were central to Roman identity, yet their worship mirrors ideas seen in other cultures, from Etruria to Greece. Overall, the Capitoline Temple was a bold statement of Rome's emerging status. Visible from land and river approaches, it symbolized the city's dominance, religious devotion, and cultural openness. More than a royal monument, it was a product of Rome's collective will and its interaction with other powerful city-states across the Mediterranean. Recent archaeological findings have shed new light on Rome's early defensive structures, revealing a complex picture that aligns more closely with ancient traditions than previously thought ancient writers, such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, describe a series of fortification efforts by Rome's early kings, beginning with the fortification of the Palatine Hill by Romulus, and culminating in the extensive walls attributed to King Servius Tullius. Although these accounts contain inconsistencies, particularly in how various hills were incorporated into the city, they share a coherent core narrative. Early Rome grew from a nucleus of hills into a much larger fortified settlement by the end of the monarchy. While scholars traditionally dismissed these wall-building stories as anachronistic or exaggerated due to the capture of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE and later repairs mentioned by Livy, recent archaeological surveys suggest the city was fortified by a substantial stone wall long before the Republic excavations have revealed stretches of an older wall made from Capellaccio tufa, a locally available volcanic stone. These blocks, cut in the Italic foot measurement, form a circuit roughly 11 kilometers long, believed to date to the 6th century BCE. This predates the better-known wall built from harder tufa, quarried from the territory of Veii, which was likely erected after its conquest in 396 BCE. Evidence supporting the earlier date includes the stratigraphy of burial sites. 8th and 7th century burials are found both inside and outside the later wall circuit, but from the 5th century BCE onward, they appear exclusively outside it. This shift suggests that a walled boundary existed by that time. Recent re-evaluation of the construction layers around the wall and accompanying ditch further supports a 6th century BCE date. Comparable fortifications from this period exist at other cities in Latium and Etruria, including Tarquini, Ardea, and even as far as Pompeii and Capua, meaning Rome's early wall was ambitious but not without precedent. The circuit enclosed roughly 427 hectares, a size unmatched in central Italy at the time and comparable to some of the largest cities of the Greek world. This does not imply a fully urbanized area, as ancient cities commonly included large expanses of open land for agriculture and religious purposes. Still, it symbolized Rome's enormous potential and assertive identity, marking it as a leading power in the region. This wall also reflects the city's political and military organization. Traditional accounts attribute both the fortifications and the famous Servian reforms, which reorganized Roman society into tribes and centuries, to King Servius Tullius. Although the dating remains uncertain, and the historical Servius may be a composite figure, the archaeological and literary evidence converge to suggest that major civic and territorial restructuring occurred during the 6th century BCE. Beyond the walls, other urban developments confirm the rapid growth and sophistication of Rome in this era. New temple foundations multiplied, especially during the reigns of the last kings. The earliest monumental example is the Temple of Hercules at the Forum Boarium, built around 580 BCE. Soon after, a new wave of temple building began, Servius Tullius is credited with founding several temples dedicated to Fortuna and a major temple to Diana on the Aventine. The latter, likely modeled on the famous Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, was an Ionic masterpiece measuring over 100 meters in length, demonstrating the growing influence of Greek architecture and religion in Rome. Archaeological evidence from early Rome includes a vast number of architectural terracottas, which provide crucial insight into the city's buildings during the late monarchy and early republic. These terracottas, often found in temple ruins and civic buildings, reflect a shift in construction practices during the 6th century BCE, initially used on a range of structures including palaces and sacred residences, such as those at Merlo and Aquarosa. They gradually became exclusive to religious and civic buildings, marking their prestige and importance. In the later 6th century, terracotta roof systems, including the Rome Vae Velatrae series, became widespread, with at least 10 such roofs identified in Rome and up to 20 more found in Etruria and Latium. These likely belonged to small temples similar to the one discovered at Sant'Omobono. The distribution of terracotta fragments across many parts of ancient Rome reveals just how extensively temple construction took place during this era. Fin spots include the western slopes of the Palatine Hill, near the future Temple of Victory, the Porta Esquilina, the Capitoline, the Comitium, the Regia, and the areas around the Forum Nancy Winter cataloged over 80 terracotta sites in Rome, datable to before the imperial period, most from the Archaic era. What's particularly striking is that this wave of temple construction did not stop with the end of the monarchy. It continued seamlessly into the early republic. Literary sources and archaeological evidence record the founding of temples to Saturn around 497 BCE, Mercury, 493 BCE, Ceres, Liber, and Libra, 493 BCE, Fortuna Mulibris, around 493 or 488 BCE, Castor, 484 BCE, and Dius Fidius, 466 BCE. This continuity suggests temple building was driven by broader social and religious developments, not merely by royal patronage. Other civic projects also reflect the city's growing infrastructure and ceremonial life. The Circus Maximus, for example, is traditionally attributed to Tarquinius Priscus and fits well within the context of expanding public festivities such as the Triumph and the Ludi Romani. Even though the earliest physical remains are from the mid-Republic, literary mentions of flooding in 363 BCE confirm its existence earlier. Likely supported by priestly records, water management was also a sophisticated concern. Tarquinius Priscus is credited with creating early drainage channels leading from the Forum to the Tiber, while his successor, Tarquinius Superbus, reportedly transformed this network into the massive underground Cloaca Maxima. Though the structure survived multiple restorations through later periods, its origins likely lie in the Archaic era. Another example of early water control is found under the Colosseum Valley, where a stone-vaulted drain system from the same period was uncovered. Additional works attributed to early kings include the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, the earliest prison near the Forum, the Tullianum, and the marketplace structures known as the Forum Tabernae. The beginnings of the city's road network are also visible during this period. Packed clay roads dating from the 8th century BCE have been discovered on the Palatine slopes and near the Meta-Sudans. These early routes evolved into an organized grid of streets, marked by rectangular stone houses. One example is a 7th century house along the Sacra Via, and another is a 6th century atrium house at the foot of the Palatine. These elite dwellings hint at a class of wealthy families already established by this time, underscored by richly furnished tombs in the nearby Esquiline Cemetery. It may seem contradictory that Rome is understood as a large and powerful urban state, while still being viewed as primarily an agrarian society. Religious traditions suggest that agriculture and livestock raising played a central role in early Roman life, especially in its formative phases. Yet, by the late Archaic period, Rome was undeniably a major city with tens of thousands of residents. It is unlikely that most of these inhabitants lived as subsistence farmers. Instead, by the 6th century BCE, Rome's economy had diversified significantly. Agriculture, pastoralism, manufacturing, and trade all played key roles. Rome had also become part of a broader Mediterranean economic network, exchanging goods, technologies, and cultural ideas with regions as far as the Near East. Agriculture remained the foundation of Roman wealth and social status. Land ownership determined military service, and those who qualified were known as assidui, while veterans settled on conquered land were called coloni. However, agriculture was not static. One major development was the introduction of vine and olive cultivation. The backbone of Mediterranean farming grapevines were grown in central Italy from the 9th century BCE, with practices influenced by Greek settlers. Wine-related festivals already appeared in early Roman calendars, revealing the cultural value of viticulture. Olive trees were cultivated by the 7th century BCE, likely spreading to Rome through contact with neighboring Etruscan communities. By the early 5th century, olive presses were a common feature of rural estates, suggesting large-scale oil production. Livestock played an equally important role. The most common animals were pigs, goats, and sheep, which provided food and raw materials such as wool. Cattle were valuable primarily as draft animals. Some ancient laws, like those recorded in the 12 Tables, reflect the importance of protecting crops and farming resources. Archaeological findings also reveal a pattern of growing rural settlements in Rome's hinterland. A key example is the site known as the Auditorium, located north of the city. In the mid-6th century BCE, it featured a large courtyard building used for food production. Later, it expanded into a complex structure with living quarters and an olive press, showing evidence of elite ownership and labor specialization. By the 5th century BCE, evidence indicates that land could be extensively concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Although ancient writers sometimes imagined early Roman farmers with tiny plots, laws enacted in 367 BCE suggest that elite estates could span hundreds of hectares. These large holdings required a dependent labor force, revealing socioeconomic inequalities that were already developing in early Rome. Evidence of craftsmanship and industry in early Rome is scattered and incomplete, especially when compared to nearby Etruria. While Etruria offers abundant proof of advanced pottery workshops and other crafts, Rome's archaeological record has been harder to reconstruct due to the city's complex layering and later developments. Still, recent excavations and renewed evaluations of earlier finds have begun to uncover details that align intriguing archaeological discoveries with ancient literary accounts. Roman manufacturing activity dates back to the 9th century BCE, particularly in pottery and metalwork. Early pottery was handmade, using coarse local clay and simple tools, reflecting small-scale, unspecialized production. However, increasing demand for finer wares, evident in the presence of Greek and Etruscan ceramics found in burial sites, suggests Rome was a sophisticated market connected to external trade networks. Although Rome didn't produce transport amphorae on a scale comparable to Etruscan cities like Volci, local workshops began to emerge by the 6th century BCE, producing items such as bucero, loom weights, and small votive objects. Notably, a 6th century BCE inscription on the Duenos vase indicates the presence of named Roman craftsmen and suggests a growing artisanal identity. Ancient sources credit early kings like Numa and Servius Tullius with organizing trade guilds for musicians, potters, metalworkers, and other crafts. Early versions of professional associations known to exist by the early Republic, the Potter's Quarter on the Esquiline mirrors similar artisan districts in other ancient cities, and shows that specialized production sites were appearing alongside cemeteries and temples. The most impressive evidence of Roman craftsmanship comes from the major building projects of the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE. These public works required mass production of roof tiles and architectural terracottas, a technology likely learned from Corinth and adapted across Italy. Clay from the Velabrum was used to create distinctive terracotta decorations on public buildings, such as temples, assembly halls, and elite residences. Some of this work was so refined that scholars believe Greek artisans may have been directly involved in the workshops. Decorative styles shifted over time, first influenced by Ionian Greek art and later by Sicilian Greek techniques, as seen in evidence from the Temple of Ceres and the painted tombs of Tarquini. While there is a noticeable drop in building and production activity during the 5th century BCE, Roman artisanship experienced a revival in the 4th century pottery workshops, produced distinctive black gloss tableware like the Genucilia plates. And metalworking also flourished, as shown by the Ficaroni cista, an ornate bronze container inscribed by its maker, Novius Plautius, declaring it was crafted in Rome. Despite claims in ancient sources that Romans disdained trade, especially seafaring commerce, evidence points to a more complex reality. Rome's strategic position along the Tiber and its growing dependence on imported grain during the 6th century BCE suggests that maritime trade was essential from an early date. The river was navigable by sizable ships, and the city had both a military harbor, the Navalia, and a commercial port, the Portus Tiberinus, adjacent to the Forum Boarium treaties with Carthage and Massilia in the late 6th and early 5th centuries. BCE further reveal Rome's early diplomatic and commercial engagement with the wider Mediterranean world. Rome's connection to the Mediterranean wasn't limited to formal trade routes. It also involved more shadowy activities like piracy. Ancient writers mention that the colony of Antium, a coastal settlement under Roman control, engaged in piracy alongside the Tyrrhenian peoples. Strabo notes that Antium's ships caused enough trouble to prompt complaints from prominent rulers such as Alexander the Great and Demetrius Poliorcetes. These appeals were directed to Rome, showing both an awareness of Roman authority and a belief that its influence extended over the piracy-prone coasts of central Italy. Although Rome didn't officially support these raids, it rarely interfered with the conduct of its colonies, allowing their maritime ventures, licit or otherwise, to flourish. The term Tyrrhenian was often used loosely by Greek authors to describe not only Etruscans, but all peoples along the northern and western Italian coastline. This means many of the so-called Tyrrhenian pirates mentioned in Greek literature could have been Romans or Latins. That Romans were involved in seafaring early on is also suggested by prophecies in the early 3rd century BCE, which foresaw Rome's dominance over both land and sea. Rome's location made it a crucial link between the coastal Mediterranean world and the more rugged interior of the Apennine Mountains. It served as a marketplace for both essential goods like grain and salt, and luxury items such as imported ceramics and exotic stones. In return, Rome offered products from the hinterland, livestock, leather, wood, and perhaps enslaved peoples that were valuable to Mediterranean traders. Archaeological discoveries reflect this exchange. The Esquiline Cemetery contains imported marble urns from Paros, high-quality Greek vases, and local imitations inspired by Eastern Mediterranean models. The sanctuary at Santo Mobano presents a particularly rich deposit of exotic objects, including Greek, Phoenician, and Etruscan items. Illustrating the city's early cosmopolitan character, Rome was also well served by land routes. The Via Salaria, one of the oldest roads in Italy, linked the city with the salt flats at the Tiber's mouth and then continued into the Sabine uplands, facilitating the exchange of salt and agricultural goods. Other routes like the Via Campana and Via Latina connected Rome to nearby centers and coastlines, helping to integrate the city firmly into the regional trade network Etruscan Bucaro pottery, found in Rome by the 6th century. BCE confirms active overland exchange with the north and highlights Rome's early role as a point of convergence. Although Roman trade in this period did not reach the scale of maritime powers like Corinth or Carthage, it was substantial and interconnected. This activity slowed in the late 5th century BCE, likely due to political instability and disruptions in Mediterranean trade, but revived in the 4th century as literary sources attest to renewed contact with Greece and Magna Graecia. The archaic Roman economy was distinct from that of later periods in several ways. Most notably, it lacked a developed slave system, relying instead on debt bondage and servitude within the community. Maritime technology was less advanced, piracy was commonplace, and centralized taxation was minimal. The earliest recorded state tax, the tributum, only appears in the late 5th century BCE. From the 4th century onward, state-controlled economic structures began to solidify, particularly as military expansion increased the need for financial resources. This shift is reflected in Rome's adoption of coinage. While the city didn't mint its own coins until the 200s and 70s BCE, it had a functioning system of weights and measures from the 6th century onwards. Coins from other regions circulated in Rome, and money handlers, or argentarii, operated in the Forum by the early 4th century BCE, indicating a bustling marketplace. When Rome did begin to issue its own coins, they were modeled on Greek types and appeared during periods of military need, particularly during the wars with Pyrrhus and Carthage. In this way, coinage symbolized not just economic growth, but Rome's increasing integration into the wider Hellenized world and its evolution into a complex, monetized state. Modern scholars have started to look much more closely at how many people actually lived in early Rome. But most detailed work still focuses on the period from the late 3rd century to the age of Augustus. The earlier monarchy and early republic remain more uncertain. Ancient authors, especially Livy, preserve a series of census totals going back to the first count traditionally attributed to Servius Tullius, but these figures are difficult to use. Later numbers from the 3rd century onward are often treated as reasonably reliable, while the earlier ones have been heavily criticized and largely rejected. There have been attempts to rescue at least part of this early tradition. But the aim here is not to choose a single correct number, rather to understand why the figures are problematic and what they might still tell us. One major issue is how such data could be preserved before the creation of the censorship in the mid-5th century, when censors began keeping the rolls of citizens, yet early Rome was clearly capable of record-keeping on other fronts. The religious calendar and the complex organization of the centuriate assembly both imply lists, counting and classification already in the 6th century. An even bigger problem is what exactly the census was counting. Livy reports that under Servius Tullius, the total of 80,000 referred to those able to bear arms. If that is true, and if we then add women and children at a proportion often used by modern historians, the total population would come out at around 280,000 people. That is unrealistically high for the size and resources of Roman territory at that time. Some scholars therefore suggest that early censuses may have covered all citizens, not just adult males, and that later writers misunderstood what those old figures really represented. Because of these doubts, many modern estimates start instead from archaeology and comparative models. A famous calculation based on the supposed carrying capacity of the Roman territory suggests that the land around the city could have supported only around 20 to 30,000 people. This is often compared with the Etruscan city of Caere, whose population has been estimated at roughly 25,000 from its cemeteries. However, using land capacity in this way is far from straightforward. Rome was already importing grain during crises in the 5th century, which strongly suggests that the population had outgrown what the immediate territory could reliably support. In addition, we do not know exactly how far Roman control extended in the 6th and 5th centuries, and the boundaries must have shifted repeatedly during war and expansion. A different method looks instead at the size of the walled urban area. For Greek city-states, studies have shown that only a fraction of the space inside the walls was actually built up, and a similar pattern likely held for Rome. Even so, the scale of the so-called Servian circuit is enormous. The fortifications enclosed roughly 427 hectares, far more than Caire's 150. If Caire could sustain about 25,000 inhabitants, Rome ought to have supported several times that number. Using typical occupation densities from Greek cities as a guide, one plausible estimate would place the population of the urban center in the 6th century somewhere between about 21,000 and 25,000 and 28,000 people, and the total Roman population, including the surrounding territory, between roughly 64,000 and 85,000. This is still hypothetical, but it fits both the archaeological picture and the literary impression of a rapidly growing community. The sources explicitly describe waves of newcomers arriving with their dependents and followers, such as Mastarna with the band of Caelius Vibena, or Attus Clausus, bringing a large body of clients from the Sabine country. Such movements are consistent with fast population growth and support the idea, advanced by some scholars, that the plebeian order emerged from the influx of outsiders during the Tarquin period. Settlement evidence from the countryside also shows an increase in occupied sites during the 6th century, which matches this story of expansion. Yet, despite this broad convergence, the detailed early census totals remain very hard to use. It is still unclear when, and on what basis, the census shifted to counting only adult males, and we cannot pinpoint a moment where the figures suddenly become trustworthy. Some early totals, such as that given for the late 6th century, are clearly too high, even if later numbers seem to reflect real trends in territory, population growth, and the gradual increase in the number of voting tribes. Alongside these demographic questions, it is important to see archaic Roman society as a dynamic system rather than a frozen, primitive stage. Older scholarship often leaned heavily on institutional fossils such as the clan and the patron-client relationship, treating them as survivals from a pre-urban past. In reality, recent work suggests that these structures are closely tied to city life and very hard to trace before the fully urban phase. Roman writers themselves liked to portray their society as rigid and deeply conservative, projecting current practices back into a distant past to legitimize existing hierarchies. Comparative studies of pre-industrial societies, however, show that underlying social arrangements can change quite quickly, even when those changes are glossed over or disguised. At Rome, many later claims of timeless austerity probably come from a specific period of economic difficulty in the 5th century, later inflated into a general image of early hardness of life. That image does not match what we see in the rich burials and monumental projects of the 7th and 6th centuries. Archaeology reveals a clearly stratified society from the late 8th century onward, with elite families distinguished by lavish tombs, substantial houses, and impressive offerings in sanctuaries. This visible display tapers off in Rome and Latium after the early 6th century, not because the elite became poorer, but because the growth of the city created new, more controlled ways of expressing status. Rather than burying wealth in graves, leading families could display their importance in public rituals, processions, and monuments in the urban center. The social landscape of early Rome was structured by a hierarchy that included a powerful elite, a broad mass of plebeians, and people in various forms of dependence and servitude. Elite groups are described in later sources using terms such as patricians, senators, equites, first-class taxpayers, and leaders of clans, but we should not assume these categories were fixed from the very beginning. The plebs, whose name is related to the idea of the multitude, stand out as a large body of non-elite citizens who increasingly organized themselves politically during the early Republic. By the 4th century, some plebeian families were clearly as wealthy and influential as older aristocratic houses. Yet earlier on, the plebs appear above all in stories of exploitation and grievance. Citizenship alone did not offer strong protection. Poor citizens could fall into debt bondage, surrendering their personal freedom to creditors. Literary accounts speak vividly of plebeians subjected to harsh treatment and even torture, and of their resentment building into collective action. Already under the last king, we hear of ordinary people being driven to exhausting labor on massive public works, and this theme continues in the intense social conflicts of the 5th and 4th centuries. Similar tensions are visible in other parts of the Mediterranean world at this time, where ideas of equality before the law and broader political participation were starting to shake older patterns of dominance. The emergence of the Roman plebs as a conscious political force is closely linked to these wider changes and to the population growth of the 7th and 6th centuries, which brought many new people into the city and its institutions. At the heart of these social struggles was the institution of debt bondage. This was distinct from outright slavery, although in practice the conditions could be close. A person who could not repay a loan might become bound to their creditor, losing control over their own labor and often living under extremely harsh conditions. Roman tradition refers to this status as nexum, and to those trapped in it as nexi. Later writers describe it as one of the central issues in the long-running conflict between the orders. Stories from the early Republic speak of former soldiers injured in Rome's wars, returning home only to be dragged into servitude over their debts, their property stripped away piece by piece before they themselves were chained and abused. Comparative work across the ancient Mediterranean shows similar mechanisms in other societies. A tough law of debt, combined with poverty and repeated crises, pushed many small farmers into the hands of wealthy lenders. Over time, military success and territorial expansion altered this balance. As Rome conquered more land and captured more slaves in war, the economic weight of bonded debtors gradually diminished, and political pressure from the plebs increased. A law traditionally dated to the late 4th century formally abolished nexum, but later complaints about debtors being treated little better than slaves suggest that some form of personal dependency persisted. Even so, the long debate over debt and bondage shows just how central economic power and social hierarchy were to the formation of the Roman state, and how deeply these questions were rooted in the city's archaic past. Ancient writers take it for granted that slavery already existed under the Roman kings. Even if their stories are not always reliable in detail, they tell us, for example, that Servius Tullius was born to an enslaved woman taken in war, and that some believed he himself had once been a slave. Later accounts from the early Republic casually mention enslaved people in ways that suggest they were a normal part of social life. A slave mistreated before a major festival, bringing down divine anger. A man being formally freed by the ritual touch of a staff in the very first year of the Republic. A rebel leader seizing the Capitoline with an army made up of exiles and slaves, and inviting other slaves to join him, and rumors of a slave uprising narrowly prevented by informers who were rewarded by the Senate. We also hear of slave actors performing at major festivals in Etruria. On their own, any single story might be doubted, because they were written down much later, but taken together and combined with the fact that slaves are mentioned in the early Roman law code and appear in Etruscan art and inscriptions of the same era, they strongly suggest that slavery in some form was already well established in central Italy long before the classical period. Alongside slaves, early Rome almost certainly contained a noticeable number of resident foreigners, occupying a role somewhat similar to the metics of Athens. We can catch brief glimpses of them in the evidence. A Greek called Kleikos, buried in the Esquiline cemetery, an Etruscan named Spurina, associated with a formal hospitality token found at Sant Omobono, the famous sculptor Volca from Veii, who worked in Rome, and other craftsmen from abroad. Whether such people enjoyed a clearly defined legal status in the Archaic Age is unclear. They may have been treated simply as outsiders living within the community, a group whose position only later hardened into more formal categories described by Roman law. One of the most distinctive social institutions in Rome, already prominent in the early Republic and almost certainly rooted in the Archaic period, was the network of patronage known as clientela. Later authors liked to say that Romulus himself had created the system by dividing the people into leaders and followers, patrons and clients, as part of his original organization of the city. This origin story is clearly simplified and idealized, and some of the details they give, such as clients being required to fund their patrons' electoral campaigns, belong to a much later political world. Yet the basic idea that powerful families maintained long-lasting bonds with dependents who looked to them for protection and support fits what we would expect in a sharply hierarchical society. Over time, these bonds were partially regulated by law. Early legal rules declared that a patron who betrayed or harmed his client could be cursed and treated as accursed before the gods, a sign of how seriously the relationship was taken. Stories from the 5th century show clients marching to war alongside the great families who led them, sometimes in large numbers. And we also hear of clients following Roman nobles into exile, or appearing under Roman influence in other cities of Etruria and Latium. The bond could be intense, reinforced by oaths, religious sanction, and the promise of land or livelihood from the patron. At the same time, it did not completely smother individual choice. Plebeians could resist the clients of arrogant aristocrats or throw their support behind more sympathetic leaders. And wealthy men might themselves be patrons to others, even as they remained clients of someone higher up the ladder. Besides clients, we also meet another type of follower in the sources, described with the old term sodales, meaning companions. These are usually small groups of young aristocrats gathered around a leading figure, fighting by his side and sharing his fortunes. We see them clustered around the Tarquin princes at the end of the monarchy, marching out with the Fabian clan when they set off to confront Voi, or surrounding fiery young nobles in the street battles of the early Republic. An inscription from the Latin town of Satricum records a dedication made by the companions of a man named Publius Valesios around 500 BC, which confirms how old this concept is. These companion bands had a strong martial and even sacred flavor, binding young elites to their leaders through shared risk and ritual as much as through family ties or formal law. The position of women in early Rome and its neighboring communities opens another window onto archaic society. Later, Roman writers liked to imagine their ancestors as grimly austere and resolutely patriarchal, but both the stories and the archaeology suggest something much more complex. Female burials from Etruria and Latium in the orientalizing and early archaic periods, often only a short distance from Rome, reveal women buried with rich jewelry, elaborate garments, and tools associated with textile work. Some of the grandest tombs probably belonged to high-status women, sometimes labeled as princesses by modern archaeologists, and they contain not only personal ornaments, but also clear symbols of authority: diadems, pectorals, elaborate seats, fans, and occasionally vehicles such as chariots, imported objects from the Near East, and Egypt add to this image, hinting at a shared ideology of power in which elite women played a visible public role. Inscriptions on tableware within such graves show that at least some of these women were literate, and the presence of writing tools reinforces that impression. Banqueting equipment is very common in female burials, and in some cases, certain forms of mixing bowls appear only in women's graves, one even carrying a greeting addressed to a hostess. In tomb paintings and sculpture from Etruscan cities, women are shown reclining beside men at feasts, sharing in rituals and display, not hidden away in the background. When we add to this the stories of marriages linking different peoples, such as Greek newcomers taking local wives in Etruscan towns, or Roman aristocrats marrying women from other Italian communities, a picture emerges of elite women as key figures in forging alliances, bridging cultures, and displaying household status. Although the literary sources are filtered through later values, and the archaeological evidence from Rome itself is fragmentary, the overall impression is that women at the top of society in archaic central Italy held a more prominent and influential position than the stereotypes of later Roman moralists would have us believe. Compared with Etruscan sites, the archaeological record for women in Rome is much thinner, and for a long time, This led some scholars to draw a very sharp line between the status of Etruscan and Roman women. That contrast does not really hold up. Rich female burials have been found in the countryside around Rome, including chariot graves at Laurentina and Castel di Decima from the late 7th century BC, which show women buried with vehicles, jewelry, and luxury goods. Inside the city, a few high-status women are visible in the cemeteries of the Forum and the Esquiline, such as a grave containing 13 brooches and another with expensive imported objects, the decorative terracotta plaques known from Rome, Veii and Velitrae, which show women reclining at banquets, drinking wine, standing among notables or taking part in processions, also point to a shared visual language across the region rather than a strong cultural divide. These roofs were almost certainly designed and made in Rome, and their imagery places Roman women in the same world of display and public ritual that we see in neighboring Etruscan and Latin centers. Taken together, this material evidence challenges later Roman and Greek claims that archaic Roman women were kept in the background, and also calls into question the idea that early Romans were uniformly frugal and severe. There is no reason to think Rome was poorer or more restrained than other Latin cities of the time. Written traditions about the earliest history of Rome also give women a much more visible role than in stories about the later Republic. Female characters appear again and again in key episodes. Some are presented as mediators whose marriages or actions bring different communities together. Lavinia, daughter of Latinus, is said to unite the newcomers from Troy with the native Latins by marrying Aeneas. Hersilia, the wife of Romulus and leader of the Sabine women, steps between armed men in the legendary clash between Romans and Sabines and persuades both sides to form a single people. In the early Republic, Veturia and Volumnia lead a procession of Roman women out to confront Coriolanus and the Volscian army, begging him not to destroy his own city and managing to turn him back. Women also appear as mothers or foster mothers at crucial points in the story of Rome's beginnings. Rhea Silvia is the mother of Romulus and Remus, while Acca Larentia, the wife of the shepherd Faustulus, takes in the twins after the she-wolf has suckled them and raises them as her own. Ancient authors even suggested that the wolf of the legend might be a play on Larentia's reputation as a prostitute, since the same word could mean both wolf and a sexually available woman. Other female figures are cast as moral examples. Some are presented as warnings, like Tarpeia, who lets the Sabines into the city in exchange for gold and is crushed beneath their shields, or Horatia, killed by her own brother because she mourns the man she was to marry, who has just fallen to Rome in single combat. The most famous model is Lucretia, whose rape and suicide are used by later writers to dramatize the fall of the monarchy and the birth of the Republic. Even Cloelia, a young girl who bravely swims across the river to escape an enemy camp, is turned into a symbol of manly courage and rewarded with an equestrian statue in a prominent spot along the sacred way. A smaller number of women are shown acting directly in politics or royal succession. Lavinia is said to have ruled Lavinium after Aeneas's death. More concrete are the stories surrounding Tanaquil, the Etruscan wife of Tarquinius Priscus, and her granddaughter Tullia, daughter of Servius Tullius. Both are given powerful king-making roles. Tanaquil persuades her ambitious husband to leave Etruria for Rome, when she feels their talents are wasted at home. On the journey, she interprets an eagle's behavior as a sign that he is destined for power, and later predicts the future greatness of Servius when flames are seen around the boy's head. She has him adopted into the royal household and ultimately married to the king's daughter. When her husband is assassinated, she appears at the palace window and tells the people that he is still alive, but unable to speak, and that Servius will act on his behalf. This gives Servius time to establish himself and take control. The striking image of a queen addressing the people from above recalls Near Eastern images of royal women and has encouraged some modern interpretations that see the queen as a key source of legitimacy and authority. Tullia, by contrast, is portrayed as the embodiment of dangerous female ambition. She is said to have engineered the murders of both her husband and her sister in order to marry her brother-in-law, Tarquinius Superbus, and then to have urged him to kill her father and seize the throne. The most shocking scene has her driving her chariot over the body of Servius Tullius in the street that later took the name Vicus Celeratus, the Wicked Street. Later, authors used her story to illustrate the horrors of tyranny and the chaos unleashed when normal limits are ignored. Lucretia's story serves a different moral purpose, holding up an ideal of female chastity and self-sacrifice. But it also advances the same political narrative by providing a dramatic spark for revolution. These tales cannot simply be read as straightforward history. They clearly bear the marks of later reworking, and they simplify what was surely a more tangled and violent series of events around the end of the monarchy. Even so, there are good reasons to think that real women of high status did play a significant part in politics at the time. Archaeology from regional neighbors shows elite women acting as visible partners in power. The prominence of royal women in the later part of the king list, rather than throughout, hints that the stories grew from particular episodes rather than a fixed pattern copied backwards. In many monarchies, queens and princesses are influential precisely because they live in the palace and control access, marriages, and succession. In Rome, the recurring theme of rulers marrying the daughters of earlier kings suggests that female kinship ties mattered greatly when power was transferred. On balance, it is likely that figures like Tanaquil and Tullia have historical cores that were gradually mythologized rather than being completely invented to mirror later models such as Livia. Their stories were probably shaped and preserved in oral tales tied to specific locations and monuments in the city, which kept their memory alive long before historians wrote them down. Legal and moralizing texts from the Republic also give us a window into how later Romans imagined the behavior of archaic women. They emphasize sobriety, modesty, and religious correctness. Some traditions claim that in the earliest days, a woman who drank wine could be punished as severely as someone guilty of adultery, even with death. And later authors heap praise on the supposed strictness of early custom. In formal marriages that symbolized full union between husband and wife, women passed under the authority of their husbands and could not initiate divorce. This strict framework was credited with keeping marriages stable and divorce rare until much later in Roman history. At the same time, some stories claim that after the famous reconciliation between Romans and Sabines, when the abducted Sabine women chose to stay in Rome, women gained certain honors and a recognized place as mistresses of the household, exempt from hard manual labor apart from spinning. These anecdotes are shaped by later ideals and anxieties, but they underline a central point. Women in early Rome were never just a silent backdrop. In law, legend, and material culture, they appear as visible actors in family life, ritual, politics, and the making of the city itself. Much of this kind of evidence is shaped by idealization. Most of the written material comes from authors of the late Republic or later, who were looking back at early Rome through a nostalgic lens and projecting onto it values like strict morality, frugality, duty, and patriotism. It is easy to see why these themes mattered so much to readers and writers living through the political crises of the late Republic. But the roots of these ideas are older. Concerns about women, family order, and moral behavior are already visible by the late 3rd century BC in the works of early writers such as Fabius Pictor, in the comedies of Plautus, and in Cato's pronouncements ritual emphasis on priestly marriage, and the insistence that Vestal candidates be of spotless reputation, also suggest that anxieties about purity and family honor did not suddenly appear in the last centuries of the Republic, but developed over a long period. Traditional institutions like confariatio marriage and the system of marital authority known as manus are very likely to be genuinely archaic, not later inventions. What is much harder to determine is how widespread they were in practice. They probably applied above all to a narrow elite rather than to every family in early Rome, despite the way ancient writers generalize them to the whole community. And by the time figures like Cato were writing, these forms already belonged to an older, fading order. It is therefore risky to set these literary images of tightly controlled Roman women directly against the archaeological picture from Etruria and conclude that Etruscan women were free while Roman women were harshly restricted. A more useful approach is to place the physical evidence for women's lives in central Italy alongside the later moralizing stories, and to use it to question and balance those stories. Burials, inscriptions, and visual art from Etruria, Latium, and the wider region show high-ranking women taking part in the same social world as men, drinking wine, presiding at banquets, and participating in elite networks. Rather than seeing Rome as exceptional or isolated, it makes more sense to treat it as part of a broader Central Italian pattern in which elite women were visible, wealthy, and active in public ritual and social life. Women also occupied a range of religious roles in early Rome and Latium. There were major female priesthoods, such as the Vestal Virgins, who tended the sacred fire, the Salians' female counterparts, and the wives of the major priests of gods like Mars, who had their own ritual duties and status. These roles almost certainly existed by the final stages of the monarchy, which can be inferred from the way they are woven into some of the oldest festivals in the calendar, including rites connected with war, horses, and the well-being of the city. Archaeological finds from rich female burials, such as bronze knives and other ritual tools, point in the same direction. Women were not only present at ceremonies, but sometimes had active parts to play. Recent work has also challenged older assumptions that women were generally barred from sacrifice or from drinking wine. It now seems clearer that bans applied in specific settings or at particular shrines, or targeted excessive behavior, rather than imposing a blanket rule on all women at all times. To understand this side of Roman society properly, we have to read the written material against the grain and set it alongside contemporary evidence from Rome's neighbors. The growing body of archaeological data now makes it possible to trace female roles across central Italy with much more precision, even though it still tells us little about formal legal status or the exact workings of marriage in practice. Taken together, the written and material evidence suggests that women in Rome and the surrounding regions were central to elite mobility and the building of alliances. Through marriage, kinship, and religious office, they helped to connect families, secure lines of succession, and anchor authority in ritual. they could influence politics and public life, even if they did not hold official offices themselves. Seen in this light, some elements in the stories about queens, such as Tanaquil and Tullia, become easier to accept as rooted in real experience, even though the tales themselves have been heavily embroidered. Earlier legendary figures like Hersilia or Tarpeia belong more clearly to the realm of myth. What gave real women opportunities for influence was the structure of society itself. Monarchies tend to give the ruling family's women particular importance because so much power flows through the palace, the household, and the royal line. It is no coincidence that the next Roman woman who dominates the political stage after Tullia is Livia, at the dawn of the imperial age when monarchy re-emerges in a new form. At the same time, the archaeological record shows that much of women's daily power was exercised in domestic settings, managing textiles, organizing banquets, overseeing adornment, and controlling the movement of wealth within the family. Spinning equipment, jewelry, and dining sets are constant features of burials and imagery. All this points to a world in which women could have real religious authority and considerable social and even political influence, but did so from within the household and family rather than through public magistracies. When we turn to the question of identity, the period before 290 BC presents its own challenges. Defining what it meant to be Roman in these early centuries is difficult, and only recently has this problem begun to receive systematic attention. The city and its wider community changed dramatically between 350 BC, moving from a regional power with a few 100,000 inhabitants to a vast state ruling the Mediterranean. Pushing back further to imagine identities around 700 BC is even more complex. Almost all of our written testimonies come from much later authors or from Greek observers looking in from the outside. For them, questions of identity were bound up with citizenship, legal status, and membership of an expanding empire, which colors the way they describe earlier times. This may help explain why the monarchy is often presented in ethnic terms, for example in stories that emphasize the foreign origins of some of the kings or the solidarity between Etruscan rulers. Modern scholarship on these topics took a major turn when researchers began to question the assumption that the main Central Italian peoples, such as Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines, were fully formed and sharply separated as early as the Iron Age. Earlier work had tried to map these groups directly onto material cultures and burial styles, but newer approaches highlight how uneven and contingent the evidence is. Written languages only become visible when people start engraving inscriptions and artifacts move across regions through trade, marriage, and migration. Studies of long-distance exchange in the late Bronze Age already show networks that help shape group identities, and finds of Mycenaean goods in Italy make it clear that Central Italy was not isolated even in very early phases. By the time we reach the orientalizing and archaic periods, patterns of mobility and exchange have intensified dramatically, with foreign artisans, traders, and ideas flowing into Central Italy, and local elites eagerly adopting symbols of power from the wider Mediterranean. This setting is crucial for understanding how ethnic identities formed. Sanctuaries and shared festivals provided strong focal points for group identity. Some of these gatherings go back to the early Iron Age, such as the Great Latin Festival held on the Alban Mount, while others seem to have emerged in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, like the meeting place of the Etruscan communities at their central sanctuary, or the Federation cult of Diana on the Aventine. The scale of these sites and the resources invested in them show just how important collective identities had become by this time. They also underline that the Latins, among whom Rome was one city, already saw themselves as a distinct group celebrating common rituals. Greek authors begin to mention Central Italian peoples and myths in this period, too. Early mentions of Latins and Tyrrhenians, tales of Aeneas' journeys west, and stories of Evander's arrival on the Tiber all suggest that Greek observers were aware of different communities in the region, even if their terminology was imprecise. The label Tyrrhenian, for instance, was often used loosely to cover a wide stretch of the western Italian seaboard. Within this world, Rome was best understood as a highly open, flexible city, drawing in outsiders and adapting ideas from multiple directions. Myths about its beginnings, the asylum on the Capitoline, the incorporation of Sabines, and the mixed ancestry of many leading families, all stress this openness. Historically, the city was a point of contact between different cultures along the Tyrrhenian coast and the inland peoples of the Apennines. It seems to have functioned as a kind of frontier city, similar to certain Etruscan centers, where inscriptions and burials reveal citizens of varied origin. Movement in and out of Rome was relatively easy in the Archaic period, with exiles and migrants frequently resettling in neighboring cities and foreigners making their homes in Rome. All this makes it hard to pin down a single, clear-cut Roman identity for the monarchy. Yet it is still possible to see strong markers of a shared Roman sense of self. Traditional stories about figures like Evander, Aeneas, and Romulus, which were already circulating by the 6th century BC, present Rome as a place where different peoples come together to form something new. They stress both connection with the wider Mediterranean and a distinctive local destiny. The names Roman and Latin appear on inscriptions outside Rome by this time, showing that outsiders had begun to recognize these categories. Ancient festivals and cults tied to the hills, gates, and landmarks of the city celebrated a unified community made up of multiple parts and remembered the city's origins in ritual form. The population of Rome also included recognizable Sabine and Etruscan elements. Leading families claimed descent from Sabine ancestors, and the early history of the city features shared triumphs over both Sabines and Etruscans. The Tarquin dynasty clearly shows an Etruscan presence at the top of Roman politics, though even here the background is mixed, with non-Etruscan ancestry also in play. Craftsmen, merchants, and laborers from different regions lived in the city and gave their names to neighborhoods. Bilingualism and cultural fusion must have been widespread. Rather than thinking in terms of rigid ethnic blocks, it is more accurate to picture a dense web of entangled histories in which languages, customs, and family lines crossed constantly. Over time, this fluid situation began to change. As city-states grew more powerful and more organized between the 7th and 5th centuries BC, belonging to a political community became more clearly tied to rights, obligations, and membership structures such as tribes and voting assemblies. The spread of colonization in the 5th and 4th centuries BC shows the state taking a stronger hand in directing movement and settlement, even though individual mobility never disappeared. In this sense, the Archaic period left a legacy of mixed origins, shared cults, and overlapping identities that later Romans tried to make sense of through stories, institutions, and traditions. Roman identity in the monarchy was already real and meaningful, but it was never simple, and it grew out of a world where boundaries were far more porous than later writers liked to admit.